Good evening, everyone. I'm Marisa Burke.
For over 20 years, Scranton, Pennsylvania welcomed local anchorwoman Marisa Burke into their living rooms.
Everybody knew Marisa Burke.
Seasoned professional, she was always first to report the news of the day.
People around here are talking about the delay in Timothy McVeigh's execution.
She also shared her life with her audience.
The news did cover my wedding, and they are excited to see the new baby.
But behind the cameras, a dark story was playing out.
I think it was an easy cover to have this normal family life and a deep, dark secret.
And this time, she'd be the last to know.
He said, Marisa, I see the FBI, state police, and it looks like they have your house surrounded. It was like somebody punched me in the gut. I was always giving the news, and never did I think I would actually become the news. It was the 80s. I had just graduated from Ithaca College in New York with a degree in broadcast journalism, and after a year and a half in Southwestern Virginia, I'd landed my dream job in Scranton, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. It was just so exciting for me to work at a station that was so reputable.
Marisa Burke, Newswatch 16, Dunmore.
We're talking about a top ABC affiliate in the country with an audience of millions every day. I would have to be at the station by 5 o'clock in the morning, so it didn't allow for a lot of social time.
This is Newswatch 16 at 11.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Marisa Burke.
In 1990, all of a sudden, I became the main anchorwoman of the 6 and 11 o'clock news. I was only 29 years old, and all of a sudden, I am the face of those newscasts.
Everybody knew Marisa Burke because she was always on camera, always on the news every night. She was just very friendly. People could relate to her, and I think that's why she was so popular.
The career was going so well, but the thing that was missing was finding somebody.
That all changes in August of 1992, when close friends host a barbecue and play matchmaker.
There is this gentleman who was impeccably dressed, dark hair, almond-colored eyes. His name was Mark Candle. He started cracking jokes, and his sense of humor just mesmerized me.
To me, he was a magnificent person and very charismatic. He was an educator, and kids were important to him. He was like a great package.
He was starting his doctoral work at the University of Maryland in administrative studies and special ed curriculum. I was thinking, wow, this guy is amazing. And before we left my friend's house that night, he turned to me and he kissed me on the cheek and said, I would like to see you again. He was living in a fraternity house, but he was being paid for being an advisor, and this was helping him pay for his doctoral degree at the University of Maryland. It was kind of a weird time visiting on the weekends because sometimes there would be parties going on around us, and we would try to seek that privacy and that intimacy, hearing the fraternity parties in the background. It didn't matter because I was focused on Mark. I couldn't find anything wrong with him. And I'm thinking, he can't be so perfect. He just almost seemed too good to be true.
Six months later, Mark invites Marisa to his parents' vacation home in Florida and pops the question. A year later, the couple marry in Danville, Pennsylvania.
The news did cover my wedding, yes. at the Basilica of St. Cyril and Methodius, which was just a beautiful landmark. It was something out of The Sound of Music. We spent our wedding night in Bloomsburg at a very quaint, intimate place. And the emotional level for me just got to a point where all of a sudden I just started crying. I thought, wow, it's over. After all of this planning, it's done in one day. And he said, honey, it's okay. I'm not gonna push you to do anything you don't want to do tonight. And he was so understanding.
Despite this awkward beginning, in the weeks and months that follow, the newlyweds seemed destined for a fairy tale marriage.
The sex life was amazing. We were so compatible. I was gratified. I felt satisfied.
I just thought their marriage was perfect. If perfect is I mean, I know there's no such thing as perfect. Seeing them interact together and how he was so attentive to her. When we would go anywhere, they would hold hands. Always hold hands. Call each other hun. The way he would make her laugh. They just laughed all the time. I envied her. I envied her.
On January 5th of 1996, I gave birth to Rachel.
There she is.
There's our big girl. There's our big girl.
Rachel.
I am not a big showy person, but that night it was on the air.
Our own Marisa Burke gave birth to a daughter this morning. We're happy to report that mother, daughter, and father Mark Candle are all doing just fine tonight.
Pictures of me holding my newborn and Mark right there, and we were just a new family.
Rachel, open up your eyes, honey. Daddy's here.
The world seems to be
Marisa continues to be the main breadwinner of the family, as her status at WNEP steadily rises. Mark completes his PhD, starts teaching at local colleges, and wins a seat on the Scranton School Board. In 1997, they welcomed their second daughter, Sarah.
He really became Mr. Mom. He started to cook. He started to bake. He cleaned the house.
In a marriage, it's never 50-50. But with the two of us, we knew that I'll be the prime breadwinner if you can pick up the work that is required to raise two babies. I was just so fortunate because he was such a great father.
The next year, the family moves to a bigger home with a pool. Mark takes charge of renovations.
Mark Handel converted the downstairs into what can be described as kind of like a man's cave. It had everything that guys would like. It was filled with sports memorabilia, workout equipment, big screen TV. It had doors going from the basement into the backyard where the pool was.
When you have a pool, neighbors and friends seem to gravitate there, and it was just the perfect atmosphere to entertain.
Mark would have young men there that were supposedly taking care of drinks or bartenders. One party, a young man was walking around in a bow tie with no shirt. My husband would say, like, you know, isn't that odd? And I always thought everybody's kind of let their guard down anyway. Everybody has a little bit too much to drink.
We had a lot of parties, and sometimes they actually got out of hand.
Marisa doesn't begrudge Mark having fun, given the heavier load he carries at home, but sometimes he pushes the limits.
Every so often, Mark would say, they're having a party this weekend, and I want to go and see some of the guys. At first, I thought, wow, you know, you're a grown man. Why would you want to go back to a campus environment?
I'm not one to judge. I would take girl trips, but he did do it a lot. And I just found it odd that he would go so much and drive all the way to Maryland.
During one of these outings, my niece came across some pictures that her uncle was at one of these fraternity parties, and it was a toga party. And even my niece at the time had said, "Don't you think that's odd?"
Before long, Marisa would discover that this was just the tip of the iceberg.
I think it was an easy cover to have this normal family life and a deep, dark secret.
He tried to live a life that was expected of him, and he just couldn't do it because he had these urges. That's where all the lies and the manipulation and the stories come in.
In 1997, 3 years after his marriage to Marisa Burke, Mark Candle is still traveling back and forth to the University of Maryland, where he parties like a single man.
At one point, I did ask him, "Why are you still going to these fraternity parties?" And did not blink an eye. His response was always, "Honey, you've got to realize I was the founding father of these fraternities." I actually dismissed it because he had such a valid explanation.
In the early 2000s, Mark lands a prestigious new job in Pennsylvania.
He worked at the Northeast Educational Intermediate Unit, where I worked as well. He would perform a lot of teacher in-services. When I was doing my cooperating teaching in the local Scranton districts, the teachers would look forward to him coming in to evaluate me because, you know, he was just funny, good-looking, very popular.
By 2004, like many busy professionals, Mark and Marisa have drifted apart.
She would say once in a while, "Well, we're like two ships passing in the night. I work one shift, he works the other."
In the beginning of our marriage, the sex life was amazing, but it started diminishing in the few years leading up to our 10-year anniversary.
With this important milestone approaching, the couple makes plans for a romantic getaway.
And I thought, wow, it's just going to be him and me for an entire weekend. We can pay attention to just the two of us. It's going to be perfect. I was preparing for days, and I had purchased special lingerie. I had bought perfume and did my nails. And that evening, I went into the bathroom and got all ready. And when I came out of the room, Mark was asleep. When I started touching him in bed, hoping that there would be some sort of arousal, he just turned to me and said, "Good night, honey bunny," and then went over on his other side. And there I am, laying in bed thinking, what in the world is going on? Was it me? Did he not find me attractive anymore? I was in shock.
For the first time, Marisa wonders if her relationship is in trouble. Things only get worse when she receives 2 anonymous emails that come in on the newsroom's public server.
The emails were telling me to go and get checked for communicable diseases because my husband was fooling around with young guys, and you don't know who your husband is, and he is doing this behind your back, and we care about you. And knowing full well that everybody else in the newsroom was reading them. The embarrassment I felt was incredible. I thought, who in the world sent these emails describing Mark in this way? Where is this coming from? I thought, this can't be true, and I dismissed it. I never even brought it up to Mark because I did not want to embarrass him. Mother's Day 2008, the girls and I decided to head to my mother's house in the Danville area. I said to Mark, let me take the girls and we will be back Sunday. And Mark said, terrific idea, because I will spend the weekend getting the property ready and getting the swimming pool ready for the summer season. I will have a nice dinner ready and we can open up your Mother's Day gifts. We returned back to Peckville Sunday evening, and as Mark promised, he had the dinner all planned out for us. He had gifts already wrapped for me to open for Mother's Day, and it was a terrific Mother's Day for me. Then, a few weeks later, I received a phone call at work, and it was Mark, and he said, honey, I'm at the district attorney's office, and I think I may be in some trouble.
He had a plan. He was a master manipulator. His public persona was so honorable. No one ever suspected any bad motives on his part.
"14 years into her marriage, Marisa Burt receives an alarming call from her husband.
I was in such a state of shock and disbelief. I said, what are you talking about? And he went on to say, that weekend that you went home for Mother's Day, I held a gathering where some young guys were at the house. I didn't know about the gathering at our house on Mother's Day weekend. He kept all of that quiet. And I'm thinking, why did he keep that from me? Why didn't he tell me that he had some guys over?
I was the deputy district attorney in charge of crimes against children. So that's how I got involved at that point. The mother that brought this to light had two sons involved with Mark Kandel. One was above the age of 18 and one was a minor. And those two sons were both at that party in May of 2008, and they came home drunk. And so we had enough to launch an investigation.
Later that evening, Marisa gets Mark's side of the story.
He said that a 17-year-old boy had snuck in, and he ended up being out all night drinking. But instead of telling his mother that he had been out with other high schoolers all night long, and said that he was at our house drinking. I believed him.
The trouble started when Kandel was arrested after hosting a party at their home while Burke was out of town. Authorities accused him of providing alcohol to a 17-year-old.
It was all over the news, and it was huge.
Obviously, somebody leaked something to the competition for them to do a story and to make it the lead story. It was like somebody just punched me in the gut. And as part of the story, they showed my house on TV and then talking about my husband as though he were a criminal. Neighbors are turning on the news. They're hearing about Mark. I broke out in this sweat, and I remember just thinking everything is crashing in right now.
You might say it's an encore.
She was scared about it. You know, she was worried that this was going to affect her job. It was really tarnishing her name and her popularity within the community. And that was devastating to her. I felt that he was being wrongly accused as well. For some strange reason, the assistant DA really was trying to hammer him on this.
Mark is charged with furnishing alcohol to a minor and is forced to resign from his job. Soon after, Marisa is called to the DA's office.
I remember walking into the assistant district attorney's office, and I said, "What is all of this about?" They were questioning a photo that they found on Mark's work laptop. It was a picture of the girls with their rear ends exposed. They were fooling around because they had just seen the movie Ace Ventura, Pet Detective with Jim Carrey. And there is a scene in that movie where he shows his backside and the girls were trying to mimic that. Mark just happened to take a picture. I was there and my mother was there, but they were turning this photo into something sordid and salacious. They ordered Mark from the home. And I remember the look on my girls' faces. And I was just feeling all sorts of emotions, from anger to sorrow. And my girls were crying and not understanding any of it.
So we had to follow up on everything just to make sure that his daughters were safe. When you tell their mom that they have to be forensically interviewed and examined for sexual abuse, that didn't sit well.
Finally, they cleared Mark of any wrongdoing in that respect.
Mark ultimately pleads guilty to the alcohol charge. He's sentenced to 90 days of house arrest and 9 months of probation.
It definitely ruined his reputation as an educator. We knew that he would probably never have another job in teaching. I was really, really disappointed and upset with the prosecutor's office that they would think that my husband was such a monster, and he wasn't.
Over the next 4 years, the family tries to put the painful episode behind them.
Mark ended up finding a job with an insurance company. Things were still going well for me at the television station. And for the first time in a while, people were not talking about what happened to Mark. We felt as though we were finally getting beyond that horrible ordeal. Around this time, Mark was really starting to pay a lot of attention to his phone. And every time we looked at Mark, he was looking at his phone. I had enough, and I said, "Why are you on your phone all the time? Why?" And he looked at me and he said, "Just checking scores." Then a couple of nights, I noticed that Mark was not coming to bed. And when I asked him about it, his answer would always be, "I was watching television in the basement and I just fell asleep," and that was that.
Rumors about Mark's odd behavior circulate amongst his friends.
We had a couple that we were friends with, and the husband would go to the same gym as Mark. Once he witnessed Mark saying things that were not appropriate to a young male in the gym. This is when I started feeling, I think I made a mistake.
It was beginning of November, and I had just finished the new newscast, and I picked up my cell phone and I saw that my neighbor across the street had called and left a voicemail. And he said, "Marisa, I don't know whether you know this or not, but I'm looking out my window and I see the FBI state police, members of the district attorney's office, and the local police. And it looks like they have your house surrounded, and it also looks like they're trying to break down your front door.
Moments after receiving a voicemail from her neighbor, Marisa Burke is in a full panic.
I felt as though time had stopped. I didn't want to reveal what my neighbor had told me out of fear. So I left, and it had to have been the longest ride home for me. I was trying frantically to call him to find out what was going on, and there was no answer. I did have this feeling in my gut again that, my God, is Mark in trouble again?
In fact, Mark is in deep trouble. The DA's office has received several complaints about him since his 2008 conviction.
We had a lot of smoke, a lot of suspicion. We probably could have held him accountable for more serious crimes in 2008 had we had more cooperation, but we didn't. Between 2008 and 2012, reports kept coming forward. Why are all these young men congregating at his house? Neighbors talked. They saw and they heard the parties that were going on in the backyard, but there's nothing illegal about that. Some would say, you know, he's just taking care of these boys. He's being good to them.
I started noticing young guys showing up to the house, looking for help with their schoolwork. There was always an explanation. They're getting ready for college entrance exams, that sort of thing.
I think he is a predator, and I think every predator has a type, and his type was young boys, maybe 13 and up. Maybe he had suppressed feelings about his own sexuality, and a lot of those feelings were illegal because they were directed towards minors.
And then there was some other information that came forward about him paying young boys to cut his grass or do yard work, and then paying them extra money to take their shirts off while doing it.
But if the boys are being paid for doing more than taking off their shirts, no one is telling the police.
He was buying gifts. He was giving money, sneakers and shoes, video games, a variety of different things.
Speedo, bathing suits, that was a hallmark. When they came to swim at his house, he would give them Speedo bathing suits. Working out with them, telling them how to build up those muscles, how to show off those muscles.
Come over and lift weights with me and I'll give you $50, $100 if you take your shirt off. Now you have high school boys who are getting money left and right from this guy for different things.
It's a grooming process when you're trying to get close to a child or a minor. People groom people to do what they want them to do. And children are particularly vulnerable to that. Depending upon their age, whatever entices them to come a little closer, that groomer knows. Getting victims to talk is one of the most difficult things. And young boys are not going to talk about any kind of sexual feelings that they have. You know, they're embarrassed. They're ashamed. They don't want their peers to know. They don't want their mom and dad to know.
Finally, in 2011, a boy comes forward to share some texts that Mark sent him. From these, it's obvious that Mark has a thing for a certain type of underwear.
Calvin Klein underwear, the CK underwear as he would call it. That's a huge red flag that an adult man is buying high school boys these tight-fitting Calvin Klein underwear. So my partners and I went to speak with all of them and review the messages. It was like joking messages, but joking sexually, my little Speedo boy. This victim wasn't very close with Mark at the time. He was just starting to try to chat with him.
It's not enough to press charges, but it is enough for investigators to mount an undercover investigation.
So what we decided to do was to assume his online identity. I began communicating with Mark as this juvenile male. Now, the communication was very late at night. It was perhaps a week long, but he was cautious. He would say things like, "You're a good boy. You're a good Christian boy. You would never try to set me up, right? I need to be able to trust you. Can we meet up?" Why, again, is a 40-some-year-old man chatting at 2 or 3 in the morning with someone he believes to be 15 or 16 years old? Based on my experience conducting these types of investigations, Mark had been at the border of what we could look at being criminal.
1 year later, police finally get their opportunity to snare Mark when the DA receives an anonymous email.
The email said, "I don't know what to do. I've been talking to this guy named Mark Candell. I'm getting scared. He's coming to my work. He's saying a lot of, strange or inappropriate things." And attached to that email was a picture. And that picture ultimately was Mark Candell's lower torso with his genital region bulging. I mean, it's not just saying hello. As soon as I saw that, I knew that we need to figure out who this email came from and talk to them immediately. This is an emergency at this point.
This minor came forward with his parents, was interviewed, turned over his cell phone.
This time, the photographic evidence from Mark on the boy's phone is explicit, enough for authorities to take action.
For all these years, we didn't have that exact and that direct evidence.
The FBI and Lackawanna District Attorney's Office execute a search warrant on Mark and Maurice's home.
We began pounding on the front door, and I see Mark go across a balcony in the second floor. In my mind, it's an officer safety issue. Is he destroying evidence? So at that point, we decided that we were going to breach the door and enter the residence. I identified myself to Mark, and I said, "We have a search warrant for your home. I'm here now, and I will listen to you, and now's the time for you to finally talk to somebody and go deep into this sexual attraction to young boys." And we did.
After years of stonewalling police, Mark Candell is ready to talk to Agent Justin Larry. He provides a glimpse into his twisted mind.
He would be overcome with these sexual urges. It's something he really couldn't control, and sometimes he would masturbate to the communications. How he phrased it was overwhelming sexual feelings. But he denied any physical sexual contact with the young boys.
By the time Marisa arrives home, the police have already gone.
Mark was there, and he was very calm and collected. And I kept on asking, why would they do this? Something motivated the authorities to raid our house again. He finally said to me, "I think there were some questionable text messages on my phone. I think some of those text messages were sexual in nature." And I looked at him in disbelief and said, "So you were sending these sexual messages to high schoolers?" And he finally looked at me and said, "Yes." Nothing was ever the same after that moment. I basically threw him out of the house.
Mark's confession is backed up by a motherlode of digital evidence from the boy who came forward.
Nearly 1,000 text messages with that minor in 1 month were recovered. And they were over the top, and they were enticing, encouraging, perverted. They were intended to persuade and coerce and to engage in sexual conduct. He pretty much found the wrong victim. That young boy who brought those text messages into the light in 2012 led to dozens of young boys being interviewed, which basically opened the floodgates to thousands and thousands of inappropriate communications with Mark Kandel.
Penis sizes to shaving pubic hair to masturbation. There would be a lot of other innuendos and sexually explicit pictures.
Part of his pleasure was looking at these young boys, looking at their bodies. And what better environment to get an opportunity to see these young boys in their bodies than in your backyard pool? And then give them alcohol. And I believe the phrase that some of these young boys used was puff and rub, because he would give them money to go buy pot, and then whatever sexually would happen would happen.
In 1 month alone, Mark had sent 13,000 texts to at least 17 underage males.
We had him. We had explicit talk, explicit offerings, and we had young men who were willing to come to court to testify.
Within 2 days of the raid, Mark is arrested and charged with 1 count of online enticement of a minor. Marisa learns the full extent of Mark's sex crimes when she reads the arrest affidavit.
It was like pieces of a puzzle all of a sudden coming together. These kids coming to the house, the obsession with the phone, the constant, nonstop texting. I read through the affidavit thinking, this guy's sick. And I felt used and betrayed. It was just horrible. The girls knew about the seriousness of the charges. They looked so sad and desperate. And I think we all felt that way that evening, was where do we go from here?
This is a very difficult night for us here at the news station. We learned this afternoon that Mark Kandel, the husband of Newswatch 16's Marisa Burke, was arrested on charges of sex abuse involving a minor.
Lackawanna County detectives brought Mark Kandel to the district attorney's office in Scranton in handcuffs. This concludes more than 3 years of investigations.
I felt as though none of our neighbors wanted anything to do with us. I was ostracized by people in the community. I experienced that public humiliation because I was still very much a public figure.
Mailing bomb threats. Cops say he's a 17-year-old boy.
And I thought, this is trauma. This is what trauma does. And this family is broken, completely broken.
I look back and think, I didn't know about what was going on with Mark because perhaps I did not want to know. 2 beautiful children. I did not want anything to ruin this or stand in the way of my life crashing down.
On December 5th, 2012, Mark is charged with 4 more counts of online enticement. Marisa files for a divorce, and the hits keep coming.
He had forged my name on some documents in order to withdraw some retirement money. It was actually a lot of retirement money. In the time that he wasn't working, this is how he was helping to pay for the bills and for some of the teenage boys' gifts.
In 2013, Mark Kandel accepts a plea deal for 1 count of online enticement of a minor. There is no trial, and Marisa does not attend the sentencing. But her youngest daughter does, and reads a victim impact statement to the court.
She wanted her father to hear it coming from her mouth. She wanted him to know what he had done to her and her sister and her mother. He was a primary caretaker for those daughters. Their bond was tremendous. So for her to come to court and read the words that she wrote and to tell the judge that she wanted her father to receive the maximum sentence, it was a wow moment. And it was a moment that really made you appreciate the harm that he did to his family. And I hope he felt that. I really hope he felt that.
A former educator from Lackawanna County has been sentenced to 14 and a half years in prison. He's a former member of the Scranton School Board and also worked for the Northeastern Educational Intermediate Unit.
He will be a registered sex offender for the rest of his life.
I had to survive. I had to survive for the sake of my career that I worked so hard for, and I had to survive for the sake of my girls. I couldn't allow what Mark did to us to ruin their lives. I put them both through school and through college.
But now it is time
Marisa remains the face of the 6 o'clock news until she retires in 2016.
I wanted to write my story so that no matter how horrible things may be, no matter how much you were betrayed and lied to, that you can get past that. This nightmare was real. I think once I came to terms with that, I was able to be okay with myself and ditch the self-pity and move on and be the better person for it.
The phone rang at 3:17 a.m., slicing through the frozen silence of a Michigan winter like a blade through glass, and in that instant, before the receiver was even lifted, before a single word was spoken, a truth began to take shape in the darkness. Something had gone terribly wrong, and nothing would ever feel the same again. Snow drifted lazily beneath the amber glow of streetlights, coating empty sidewalks in a deceptive calm. While inside a small brick house on the outskirts of a quiet industrial town, a single lamp burned beside an untouched cup of coffee, its surface already cooling, its steam dissolving into the stale air. A teenage bedroom stood abandoned, the bed neatly made, the window slightly open, curtains stirring faintly in the wind. No signs of struggle. No note. No goodbye. Only absence, thick and oppressive, swallowing every sound. Her name was Emily Carter, 17 years old, high school honor student, part-time waitress. Known for her soft voice, her cautious smile, and the way she always walked home before sunset. She vanished on a Tuesday night in February of 1992, just 6 blocks from her front door, and by dawn, the town was awake, restless, whispering her name like a prayer that already felt unanswered. Patrol cars fanned out across frozen streets. Officers knocked on doors, still heavy with sleep. Neighbors stood in bathrobes and slippers, breath fogging in the cold, shaking their heads in disbelief. Emily didn't run away. Everyone knew that. She didn't drink, didn't use drugs, didn't sneak out. Her world was small, predictable, carefully ordered. And now she was gone. At the corner of Pine and Mercer, her scarf lay half buried in slush, the fabric darkened by melted snow and road grime. A scuffed footprint marred the icy sidewalk nearby, too distorted to identify, too ordinary to prove anything. There were no witnesses, no screams, no tire tracks, just a quiet intersection and a single abandoned piece of clothing, fluttering slightly in the wind, like a signal that something unseen had crossed through. By noon, her face filled television screens. By sunset, her name echoed from radio broadcasts. By midnight, the word everyone dreaded had begun to circulate in hushed tones: abduction. Search teams combed wooded areas, drainage ditches, abandoned buildings, frozen riverbanks. Helicopters swept low over dark farmland. Volunteers formed long lines, shoulder to shoulder, dragging sticks through waist-high grass, hoping to uncover anything that would lead them closer to the truth. But the land remained silent, and with each passing hour, the silence grew heavier. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. Posters faded on telephone poles. Candlelight vigils flickered and died. And slowly, painfully, Emily Carter became a name spoken in the past tense. Then, 9 months later, a hunter stumbled upon something half-buried in a remote stretch of woodland nearly 40 miles north of town. It was a shallow grave, disturbed by animals, exposed by erosion and melting snow. Inside lay a skeleton wrapped in the remnants of a winter coat. Dental records confirmed what everyone already feared. Emily had been there all along, hidden just far enough away to avoid discovery, close enough to ensure she would never truly leave. The autopsy delivered no clarity. Severe decomposition erased precise timelines. The cause of death could not be definitively established. No weapon recovered. No clear trauma. No identifiable fibers. No DNA technology advanced enough to provide answers. What remained was a single, haunting conclusion. Emily Carter had been murdered, and whoever took her knew exactly how to disappear afterward. The investigation exploded outward, a chaotic storm of interviews, tips, accusations, and rumors. Hundreds of names flooded in. Ex-boyfriends, coworkers, teachers, neighbors, drifters, anyone who had crossed her path. Detectives worked around the clock, fueled by stale coffee and sleepless nights, chasing every whisper, every half-remembered detail, every shaky alibi. Yet each promising lead dissolved under scrutiny. Witness accounts conflicted. Timelines fractured. Evidence contradicted itself. A gas station clerk claimed she saw Emily get into a blue sedan. No such vehicle was ever confirmed. A bus driver thought he spotted her walking alone toward the highway. Surveillance footage was grainy, inconclusive, almost mocking in its ambiguity. A trucker swore he picked up a hitchhiker matching her description. His story unraveled under questioning. Every path led into fog. As frustration mounted, suspicion turned inward. The town, once bound by familiarity, began to fracture under the strain of uncertainty. Neighbors eyed one another warily. Old grudges resurfaced. Quiet men became objects of fear. Friendly smiles felt suddenly rehearsed. And everywhere, the same unspoken question lingered. If it could happen to Emily, who would be next? At school, her locker remained sealed, draped in flowers and handwritten notes. Her best friend, Laura Simmons, stopped attending classes altogether, haunted by the last conversation they'd shared, replaying every word, every laugh, every fleeting complaint, searching for some hidden warning she might have missed. Emily had mentioned feeling watched. Just once. A passing comment, brushed aside in the casual way teenagers dismiss unease. Now it echoed relentlessly, a whisper too late to matter. Detectives followed that whisper into darker territory. Several men emerged as persons of interest. A factory worker with a history of violent outbursts. A delivery driver who frequented her diner shift. A neighbor twice her age who kept binoculars by his bedroom window. Each man was interrogated. Each denied involvement. Each walked free. No physical evidence tied any of them to the crime. No eyewitness could place them with her that night. And in 1992, without DNA databases, without cell phone tracking, without digital surveillance, the investigation bled slowly to death. By the second year, the case was already being whispered as a cold case, though no one dared say the words aloud. Files thickened. Evidence bags yellowed. Leads went stale. Funding evaporated. The detectives who had sworn to find her killer were reassigned, retired, or simply burned out. Their desks eventually cleared, their memories left to gather dust alongside the unopened boxes. Emily's parents never moved. They kept her bedroom exactly as she'd left it. Her clothes hung untouched. Her notebooks lay open on her desk, unfinished homework frozen in time. Every night, the porch light remained on, a silent beacon in the darkness, a promise that if she somehow returned, there would still be a place for her to come home. Years passed. 10, 15, 20. New families filled the neighborhood. New students walked the high school halls. New names replaced old ones on the town's missing persons lists. But beneath the surface, the case never truly disappeared. It lingered like a scar, faint but permanent, a reminder that some questions never find answers. Then, in the winter of 2022, 3 decades after Emily vanished, a man walked into a police station nearly 200 miles away, his hair gray, his hands trembling, his voice barely above a whisper. He carried no lawyer, no prepared statement, no demands, only a single, devastating sentence. I need to tell you what I did in 1992. Detectives initially dismissed him as another confessor chasing attention, another false prophet offering lies wrapped in guilt. But as he spoke, details spilled out that had never been released to the public. The scarf, the intersection, the shallow grave in the woods, the long drive through falling snow, the smell of pine and damp earth, the way her breath fogged in the cold. Information only the killer could know. His name was Daniel Reeves. At the time of the murder, he was 24 years old, a delivery contractor who traveled frequently between rural towns, invisible, forgettable, blending seamlessly into the background of everyday life. He had never been questioned, never interviewed. His name had never once crossed an investigator's desk. For 30 years, he lived an unremarkable existence. Married, divorced, held steady jobs, paid taxes, attended church occasionally, smiled at neighbors, slept beside women who never suspected that inches away lay a man capable of unspeakable violence. What finally broke him remains uncertain. Some say terminal illness. Others suggest religious awakening. A few whisper that he feared modern forensic technology would eventually expose him. But when he began to speak, his confession unfolded with chilling clarity, each word a hammer blow against a past thought safely buried. He described spotting Emily walking alone, described offering her a ride, described the moment she hesitated, then accepted, described the sudden shift when she realized something was wrong, described panic, resistance, silence. And in that silence, the case that had haunted Michigan for 30 years finally began to breathe again. But confession alone does not guarantee truth. Detectives reopened dusty boxes, re-examined degraded evidence, reassembled timelines long thought beyond repair. They compared his account against what little physical proof remained. They retraced his alleged route. They searched the woodland grave once more, hoping modern technology might uncover what the past had missed. And slowly, piece by fragile piece, the story began to align. The scarf, the location, the manner of burial, the specific turn-off a forgotten logging road, the shallow depth of the grave. Each detail fell into place with terrifying precision, confirming what the town had feared but never proven. Emily Carter had not vanished into nothing. She had been taken by someone who blended so completely into everyday life that no one ever saw him. As news of the confession broke, shockwaves rippled through the community. Old residents stared at television screens in disbelief. New families struggled to reconcile the peaceful streets they knew with the horror buried beneath them. Emily's parents, now elderly, listened in stunned silence as detectives finally spoke the words they had waited 30 years to hear. "We know who did this." Yet even as one mystery seemed to resolve, deeper questions emerged from the shadows. Why her? Why that night? Why that place? Why had no one ever noticed him before? And how many other moments like this, how many other secrets, were still hiding in plain sight, waiting for the fragile courage or unbearable guilt of a single man to bring them to light? In the quiet hours before dawn, as police processed Daniel Reeves and prepared to reopen the darkest chapter in the town's history, the same winter silence that had once concealed Emily's disappearance returned, thick and unyielding, pressing against every closed door, every shuttered window, reminding everyone that the past is never truly gone. It only waits. And in Michigan, in the frozen aftermath of a confession 3 decades too late, the cold case that refused to die had finally begun to speak. The interrogation room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, the kind of sterile odor that clung to government buildings and never quite faded, no matter how many years passed or how many confessions were spoken within its walls. Daniel Reeves sat motionless beneath flickering fluorescent lights, his hands folded neatly in front of him, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall, as if the present moment were already too heavy to endure. 30 years of silence pressed down on his chest, and with each shallow breath, the weight of what he had carried began to fracture. Detectives took their seats slowly, deliberately, careful not to rush what felt like a moment suspended outside of time. On the table between them lay a thin manila folder marked with a name that had haunted Michigan for decades: Emily Carter. Inside were grainy photographs, brittle reports, yellowed witness statements, and evidence logs written in ink that had begun to fade. This was all that remained of a girl whose life had ended before it ever truly began. Reeves began to speak without prompting, his voice low, uneven, cracking at unexpected moments. He described the night as if it were unfolding before his eyes, each detail resurfacing with brutal clarity. The snow, the cold, the radio humming softly in his truck, the dull ache of loneliness that had followed him for months, perhaps years. He claimed he had not planned anything, that he had simply seen her walking, small and solitary beneath the streetlights, and an impulse he did not understand had seized control. He spoke of slowing the vehicle beside her, of offering a ride, of feigning concern for her safety. He remembered the way she hesitated, clutching her scarf tighter around her neck, glancing back toward the direction of her home, calculating risk in the way only young women learn to do too early. He told them she agreed only after he promised he lived nearby, only after he insisted it was too cold to walk alone. The detectives listened in silence, their expressions carefully neutral, though each word scraped against the raw nerves of an investigation long thought beyond salvation. They interrupted only to clarify small details: the model of the truck, the route he took, the exact location where he claimed she entered the vehicle. Each answer aligned disturbingly well with fragments pulled from old witness statements, long dismissed for lack of corroboration. As his confession deepened, the room seemed to shrink. Reeves described the drive north, away from the town, into stretches of dark road where headlights were swallowed by falling snow. He recalled her growing unease, the way her voice trembled as she asked where they were going, the way panic surged when she realized his answers no longer made sense. He spoke of the struggle, brief but violent, of fear erupting into chaos, of silence descending far too quickly. At times, his words faltered, swallowed by long pauses heavy with unspoken detail. When he continued, his voice had changed, drained of emotion, as if he were reciting a memory he had long ago stripped of feeling in order to survive it. He described pulling onto a logging road, driving until the tracks vanished beneath fresh snow, dragging her body into the woods, digging into frozen soil with numb hands, covering the shallow grave with leaves and dirt that barely concealed the truth. When he finished, the room remained silent for nearly a full minute. No one spoke. No one moved. The enormity of what had just been said hovered between them, suffocating in its weight. Then came the questions. Why her? Why that night? Reeves swallowed hard, eyes flicking upward for the first time. He claimed there was no reason, no motive, no planning, just a moment that spiraled beyond control. An answer that satisfied nothing, that explained nothing, that only deepened the horror. Because randomness made the crime more terrifying. If there was no reason, no trigger, no pattern, then safety itself was an illusion. Investigators immediately began the slow, meticulous process of verification. Confessions, especially those delivered decades after the fact, are treacherous terrain. False admissions are not rare. Memories distort. Guilt invents narratives. Mental illness reshapes reality. Every word had to be tested, every detail weighed against surviving evidence. Old boxes were unsealed. Fragile documents carefully unfolded. Handwritten notes transcribed into digital form. Locations plotted. Timelines reconstructed. They traced Reeves' employment records, confirming he had indeed been working delivery routes through southern and central Michigan in early 1992. Gas station receipts placed him within miles of Emily's neighborhood the night she disappeared. Motel logs showed a check-in far north of town the following morning, consistent with his claimed route. Then there was the scarf. In his confession, Reeves mentioned it without prompting, describing its faded blue pattern and the frayed edge near one corner, details never publicly released. He recounted how it slipped from her grasp during the struggle, how he noticed it tangled near the curb as he sped away, how he considered retrieving it, but fear propelled him forward. That single detail sent a ripple through the investigative team. Only someone present could have known. But the greatest test lay in the woods. Detectives guided Reeves to the remote location where Emily's remains had been discovered nearly 30 years earlier. Time had transformed the landscape. Saplings had become towering pines. Logging roads had vanished beneath undergrowth. Snow softened every contour, rendering distances deceptive. Yet Reeves walked with unsettling confidence, navigating bends and slopes until he stopped at a small clearing, his face draining of color. Here, ground-penetrating radar confirmed subtle soil disturbances consistent with the original burial site. He had not guessed. He had remembered. For the first time in decades, the case began to feel real again, as if the past itself had cracked open, releasing truths long buried beneath layers of time and denial. As news leaked, reporters descended upon the town, cameras flashing beneath gray winter skies. Headlines screamed of confession, of resolution, of justice finally delivered. But inside the Carter household, the reaction was far more complicated. Emily's mother, Margaret, listened as detectives recounted Reeves' statement, her hands trembling violently, her eyes fixed on a family photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. In it, Emily stood between her parents, smiling shyly, arms tucked close to her sides, unaware that her image would one day become a symbol of loss. Margaret said nothing for several minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. Why did it take so long? Her husband, Thomas, stared down at the floor, jaw clenched so tightly his muscles quivered. For 30 years, he had lived with a constant, corrosive question. Had he failed to protect his daughter? Now, even with answers, that burden did not lift. If anything, it grew heavier, sharpened by the knowledge that the man responsible had lived freely, unpunished, for 3 decades. Across town, memories long suppressed resurfaced. Neighbors recalled fleeting interactions with strangers that now felt ominous. A woman remembered a delivery truck idling near her driveway one snowy evening. A man recalled giving directions to someone who seemed unusually anxious. These fragments, once meaningless, now carried unbearable weight. Everyone wondered if they had unknowingly crossed paths with a killer, if a single different choice might have altered the course of history. Meanwhile, investigators pursued every possible avenue, searching for corroborating evidence strong enough to withstand courtroom scrutiny. Advances in forensic science offered new hope. Soil samples preserved from the burial site were reanalyzed. Trace fibers were subjected to modern techniques. Even degraded biological material was re-examined in the faint hope of extracting DNA. The results were limited, constrained by time and contamination, but fragments aligned. Soil from Reeves' boots, stored in an unrelated evidence file from a traffic stop years later, bore mineral compositions matching the burial site. A hair recovered from Emily's coat showed characteristics consistent with Reeves' genetic profile, though insufficient for definitive identification. Each piece added weight to a narrative long denied. Reeves remained in custody, his demeanor subdued, cooperative, almost relieved. During additional questioning, he spoke of the decades that followed the crime, of sleepless nights and recurring nightmares, of sudden panic whenever he heard police sirens, of a life lived in constant fear of exposure. He described moments when he considered turning himself in, moments when he stood outside police stations, heart racing, only to retreat once more into silence. He married. He divorced. He moved from town to town. Yet the memory never loosened its grip. In his words, Emily's face followed him everywhere, a silent witness to every attempt at normalcy. And yet, despite this torment, he had remained free, building a life atop the ruins of another's. For prosecutors, the challenge was immense. 30 years had eroded much of the physical evidence. Witnesses had died, moved away, or forgotten critical details. Memories blurred. Records vanished. They would need to construct a case strong enough to overcome time itself, to convince a jury that this confession, paired with fragile corroboration, constituted proof beyond reasonable doubt. As preparations began, the town held its breath, because while the confession promised closure, it also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Old suspicions resurfaced. Old accusations regained currency. Some residents questioned the truthfulness of Reeves' account, unwilling to believe that justice could arrive so late, in such an improbable form. Others clung to it desperately, eager for any ending, any certainty, no matter how incomplete. And beneath it all, a darker realization settled in. For 30 years, Emily Carter's killer had lived among them. He had shopped in their stores, eaten in their restaurants, smiled at their children, passed them on quiet sidewalks beneath falling snow. Evil had not worn a monstrous face. It had looked ordinary, familiar, forgettable. That truth, more than any headline or courtroom drama, would linger long after the verdict. Because if one man could hide such darkness so completely for so long, how many others walked unseen through the fragile fabric of everyday life? As winter tightened its grip on Michigan once more, and the machinery of justice began to turn after decades of silence, the town stood suspended between relief and dread, aware that while one mystery neared its end, the echoes it unleashed would haunt them for generations. And somewhere, deep in the quiet woods where snow muffled every sound, the earth held its breath, remembering what it had been forced to conceal. The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper, a sterile stillness hanging in the air as though the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Sunlight filtered weakly through tall, narrow windows, casting pale rectangles across rows of empty benches. In a few hours, those benches would be filled with reporters, relatives, former neighbors, strangers drawn by morbid curiosity, and citizens desperate to witness the final unraveling of a mystery that had haunted them for half their lives. Outside, news vans lined the street like silent sentinels. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, hungry for signal, ready to beam the story of a 30-year-old crime back into the global bloodstream. Headlines had already begun to circulate. Cold case confession shocks Michigan town. Murder walks free for decades before surrendering. 30 years of silence end in one chilling sentence. Each variation clawed at the same truth, that time, no matter how vast, could not erase violence. Inside a quiet conference room, prosecutors spread evidence across a long table, arranging it not as artifacts, but as fragments of a life violently interrupted. Photographs, maps, diagrams, witness statements, employment logs, gas station receipts, soil analyses, hair samples, each piece fragile, imperfect, corroded by age, yet together forming a narrative that refused to disappear. They understood the burden before them. Confessions, especially those delivered decades after the fact, were notoriously vulnerable in court. Memories blurred. Motivations shifted. Jurors demanded certainty, not speculation. And yet this case demanded belief that truth, delayed, still mattered. Across the hall, Daniel Reeves sat alone in a holding cell, staring at the scuffed concrete floor. He had asked for no visitors, declined legal counsel, offered no requests beyond water and a blanket. In the silence, his mind drifted backward, pulled relentlessly toward that frozen night in 1992, the moment that fractured his existence into before and after. In his recollections, the world had felt smaller then, tighter, suffocating. Long hours on empty roads. Motels that smelled of stale smoke and detergent. Meals eaten alone beneath flickering neon. His thoughts, he claimed, had grown dark, obsessive, circling an unnamed void. Yet even now, confronted by the enormity of his actions, he struggled to articulate what truly drove him. The absence of motive unsettled investigators more than any explanation could have, because randomness stripped away comfort. If no clear cause existed, then no amount of caution could guarantee safety. As jury selection approached, the town's collective memory surged back to life. Residents who had been children in 1992 suddenly found themselves reliving images they had tried to forget. Candlelight vigils in the school gymnasium, prayer circles in frozen parking lots, the endless procession of volunteers combing fields and forests. For some, the case had been their first encounter with mortality, their first realization that danger could slip quietly into even the most familiar places. Now, those same individuals brought their own children to school beneath watchful eyes, haunted by a knowledge that innocence could be stolen in an instant. In the Carter household, preparations took on a ritualistic quality. Margaret Carter carefully pressed a navy blouse she had not worn in years. Thomas polished his shoes until the leather gleamed. Neither spoke much. Words, after decades of waiting, felt insufficient. What could one possibly say in the face of a truth that arrived 30 years too late? They moved through their home like ghosts, passing Emily's bedroom, still preserved in fragile suspension. Dust had been wiped away countless times, yet the air inside remained heavy with absence. On her desk lay a notebook filled with teenage scrawl, lists of college aspirations, half-written poems, fragments of dreams that would never find shape. Margaret paused there, fingertips brushing the edge of the paper, breathing in a memory she could never release. In her heart, closure and anguish coexisted, intertwined beyond separation. The trial opened under intense scrutiny. From the first moment, tension saturated the courtroom. Reeves entered in shackles, thinner than he appeared in his mugshot, eyes hollow, movements restrained. He did not look toward the gallery. He did not seek the Carter's gaze. He simply lowered himself into his seat, shoulders slightly hunched, as though already carrying the weight of a verdict. Prosecutors laid out the story with methodical precision, weaving together threads that spanned 3 decades. They traced Emily's final steps, the disappearance, the fruitless searches, the discovery of her remains, the long stagnation of the investigation. They introduced Reeves as a phantom presence, a man who had moved through the periphery of the town unnoticed, unremarked, invisible. Then they unveiled the confession. Audio recordings filled the courtroom, Reeves' voice echoing faintly, stripped of emotion, recounting moments too horrific for embellishment. Gasps rippled through the audience. Some listeners covered their mouths. Others closed their eyes. A few leaned forward, transfixed, unable to look away. When the recording ended, silence hung heavy, broken only by the muted sobs of Emily's mother. The defense rose cautiously. Their strategy was clear: undermine the reliability of memory, highlight the absence of definitive forensic proof, emphasize the dangers of conviction based largely on a single confession. They suggested psychological fragility, false memory, misplaced guilt. They questioned why Reeves had come forward now, after so many years, hinting at attention-seeking or mental deterioration. They asked jurors to imagine the consequences of error. The prosecution responded with relentless focus. They presented employment records confirming Reeves' proximity, gas station logs aligning with his route, motel receipts corroborating his timeline, soil analysis consistent with the burial site, the unreleased details he had known, the precise location he had identified in the forest. Each element, imperfect alone, formed a mosaic of damning coherence. Expert witnesses spoke of memory degradation, yes, but also of how traumatic events imprint themselves indelibly, resisting erosion. They explained how certain sensory fragments, smells, sounds, tactile sensations, anchor recollections in ways time cannot dissolve. Reeves' detailed recall of the scarf, the road, the woods, they argued, exceeded what fabrication could reasonably produce. As days passed, the courtroom became a crucible of grief, anger, and fragile hope. Witnesses from 1992 returned to the stand, older, wearier, their voices trembling as they revisited nights they had spent searching in freezing darkness. A retired detective described the crushing frustration of chasing leads that vanished like smoke. A former classmate recounted the shock of learning Emily would never return, the way adolescence abruptly ended that winter. And then, Emily's parents testified. Margaret spoke first. Her voice shook as she described her daughter's laughter, her cautious kindness, her habit of leaving handwritten notes on the kitchen counter. She recounted the moment police knocked on her door, the way the world narrowed to a single, unbearable point. She spoke of years spent waiting for footsteps that never came, of birthdays celebrated in silence, of holidays shadowed by absence. Thomas followed, his words few but devastating. He described standing in the woods where Emily was found, staring at the earth, unable to comprehend that his child lay beneath it. He spoke of the long nights awake, of the guilt that gnawed relentlessly, of the promise he had made to himself never to stop seeking answers. Their testimony reduced the courtroom to tears. Reeves remained motionless, eyes fixed ahead, jaw clenched, hands trembling faintly. Whether remorse or fear gripped him was impossible to tell. As closing arguments approached, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Outside, crowds gathered, whispering speculation, clinging to rumors. Some hoped for conviction, eager for justice, however belated. Others feared a mistrial, haunted by the prospect that the truth might once again slip through the cracks of time. Inside the jury room, 12 strangers faced an impossible task: to weigh fragments of a life shattered decades ago, to render judgment on a man who had lived freely for 30 years, to decide whether confession and circumstantial corroboration could substitute for the lost certainty of fresh evidence. They pored over transcripts, replayed audio, studied maps, debated memory, examined motive, argued intention, considered doubt. Hours stretched into days. Sleep eluded them. The gravity of their responsibility pressed heavily upon every breath. In the end, they returned to a single question. Did they believe him? Not whether they pitied him, not whether they understood him, but whether the totality of evidence convinced them beyond reasonable doubt that Daniel Reeves had taken Emily Carter from the world. When they emerged, the courtroom rose as one. The verdict was read in a voice that wavered only slightly.
Guilty.
A sound escaped the gallery, part sob, part exhale, part release. Margaret collapsed into Thomas's arms. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. Reeves closed his eyes, shoulders sagging, as though the weight he had carried for 30 years had finally crushed him. Sentencing followed weeks later. Reeves received life imprisonment without parole. Justice, delayed beyond reason, had at last arrived. And yet, as the courtroom emptied, as microphones were shut off and headlines finalized, an unsettling awareness lingered. Nothing could restore Emily's stolen years. Nothing could erase the suffering etched into her family's bones. Nothing could reclaim the decades consumed by silence and uncertainty. The confession had ended the mystery, but it had not ended the pain. In the weeks that followed, the town attempted to return to normalcy, but something fundamental had shifted. Conversations grew quieter. Trust frayed. Parents tightened their grip on children's hands. Doors locked earlier. Windows closed more tightly against the night. The revelation that evil could hide so easily, so completely, for so long had cracked the fragile illusion of safety. And in the shadows of everyday life, a chilling realization took root. The most terrifying monsters do not announce themselves. They blend in. They wait. And sometimes, they walk free for 30 years, carrying secrets that can shatter worlds. In the days after the verdict, the town did not celebrate. There were no cheers, no public declarations of triumph, no sense of victory. Justice had arrived, yes, but it came burdened with 30 years of grief, too heavy to lift, too late to heal. What remained was a quiet, aching stillness, the kind that settles after a storm when everything familiar feels subtly rearranged. Snow continued to fall, dusting rooftops and sidewalks in white, muffling sound, softening edges, disguising scars. Yet beneath that fragile calm, something irreversible had shifted. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. Neighbors studied one another with cautious eyes. Every unfamiliar face lingered a moment too long in collective memory. Because the confession had not only named a killer, it had shattered an illusion. For decades, residents had clung to the belief that such darkness belonged elsewhere, in distant cities, in nameless places glimpsed through television screens. Now they knew the truth. The monster had lived among them, shopped beside them, smiled at them, and no one had seen. In the Carter home, silence settled like a second layer of dust. Margaret found herself waking at dawn, listening for sounds that would never come, a habit forged over 30 years of waiting. Thomas wandered the house in restless loops, pausing at windows, standing beneath the porch light that still burned each night, as though expecting Emily to appear in its glow, unchanged by time. Grief, long suspended, began to move again. With the case officially closed, investigators turned inward, scrutinizing their own past decisions, their missed connections, their unanswered questions. How had Reeves escaped notice? How many small clues had slipped through the cracks? Was there a moment, buried deep in dusty records, when the truth had brushed past unnoticed? They reopened early interviews, examining transcripts with modern eyes. One statement from a gas station attendant described a man matching Reeves' general appearance purchasing fuel near Emily's neighborhood the night she disappeared. At the time, it had been logged, filed, forgotten, lost among hundreds of similar tips. Another witness had mentioned a delivery truck idling near Pine Street. Again, noted, dismissed, buried. Individually, each fragment meant little. Together, they formed a ghostly outline of what might have been. The realization cut deeply. Not because mistakes were unusual, they were inevitable in investigations of such magnitude, but because those mistakes carried unimaginable consequences. A life lost, a family shattered, a community scarred, and a killer left free to walk the earth. The detectives, now older, grayer, some long retired, grappled with this reckoning in private. For many, the case had been the defining failure of their careers, a wound that never fully closed. Now, with its resolution, relief mingled with regret, pride with shame. Closure did not arrive cleanly. It arrived jagged, incomplete, shadowed by the knowledge that time itself had been the greatest accomplice. Meanwhile, Daniel Reeves disappeared into the machinery of the prison system, swallowed by concrete walls and razor wire. His story faded quickly from headlines, replaced by newer tragedies, fresher scandals, more immediate horrors. Public attention moved on, as it always does, leaving behind only the residue of unease. Yet inside his cell, Reeves remained suspended in a relentless present, haunted by a past he could neither escape nor rewrite. Nights brought fragmented sleep, punctured by memories that surged without warning, headlights cutting through snowfall, the echo of a frightened voice, the dull thud of earth against a shovel. In these moments, remorse and fear fused into something indistinguishable, an endless loop of consequence. He wrote letters he never sent, confessions he never delivered, apologies that found no recipient. He asked for no special treatment, no leniency, no understanding. When a prison chaplain visited, Reeves spoke only once. "I waited too long." Outside those walls, the town struggled to understand what forgiveness might mean in the aftermath of such devastation. Some residents advocated compassion, citing Reeves' apparent remorse, his eventual confession, his acceptance of punishment. Others rejected any notion of mercy, arguing that time had stolen Emily's future and nothing could repay that debt. The divide ran quietly through conversations, through family dinners, through late-night reflections. For the Carters, forgiveness remained an abstract concept, distant and unreachable. They did not speak of Reeves. They spoke of Emily, of her favorite songs, her nervous laughter, the way she hummed while studying, the freckles across her nose. They focused on preserving what remained of her presence, clinging to memories as lifelines. Each year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, they returned to the woods. They stood where her body had been found, beneath towering pines now grown thick and ancient, and placed fresh flowers on soil that had once concealed unbearable truth. Snow often fell during these visits, softening their footsteps, absorbing their tears. In these moments, time collapsed. Emily was 17 again, and they were young parents once more, still believing the world could be safe. The town erected a small memorial near Pine and Mercer, the intersection where her scarf had been discovered. A simple plaque. Her name, her dates. A quiet reminder that even ordinary places can harbor extraordinary tragedy. Passers-by paused there, reading, reflecting, sometimes leaving tokens, ribbons, handwritten notes, single white roses. Children asked questions. Parents struggled to answer. Because how does one explain that evil can emerge without warning, without reason, without visible sign? As months passed, life gradually resumed its familiar rhythms. Schools buzzed. Factories hummed. Cars flowed through streets dusted with spring pollen and summer heat. Yet the case lingered, an undercurrent shaping perception, altering trust, redefining normalcy. People locked doors they once left open. They hesitated before offering help to strangers. They glanced twice at delivery trucks idling on quiet streets. And beneath it all, a deeper, more troubling awareness took root, that safety is not a constant, but a fragile agreement, upheld only by vigilance and hope. Across the broader landscape, Emily's case joined a grim constellation of cold cases resurrected by confession, DNA, and technological advance. Investigators nationwide studied it, extracting lessons, reevaluating protocols, questioning assumptions. Her story became both cautionary tale and catalyst, fueling renewed efforts to revisit unresolved crimes, to rescue forgotten names from the margins of history. In this way, Emily's death began to ripple outward, influencing lives she would never meet, shaping futures she would never witness. Yet for those who had known her, none of this softened the loss. In quiet moments, Margaret imagined the woman her daughter might have become, the career she might have pursued, the family she might have built, the simple joys she might have known. Thomas wondered whether he would have been a grandfather by now, whether Emily's children would have inherited her gentle humor, her thoughtful eyes. These questions had no answers, only echoes. Sometimes, late at night, when the town lay still and the wind whispered through bare branches, residents swore they felt her presence, not as a ghost, but as a memory woven into the fabric of place. In the hush between passing cars, in the glow of streetlights on fresh snow, in the soft creak of porch steps beneath unseen feet. A reminder that no story truly ends. It only recedes, waiting for someone to listen. And so, the Michigan cold case, unraveled at last, continued to live on, in whispered conversations, in cautious glances, in the careful way parents held their children close. A testament to the enduring power of memory and to the irreversible consequences of a single, terrible moment. Because, while the confession closed the file, it could not close the wound. And in that lingering ache, the town learned a truth as unsettling as it was unavoidable. Some mysteries, even when solved, never truly release their hold. They simply change shape, settling into the shadows of everyday life, where they wait, silent, reminding us that beneath the surface of the ordinary, the extraordinary, and the unthinkable is always near. Time did not soften the edges of what had happened. It only taught the town how to live around the wound, how to step carefully across memories that still felt raw, how to breathe in spaces where grief had long since replaced air. The case was closed, the confession sealed into court transcripts, the killer locked behind steel doors, yet the emotional gravity of the crime refused to loosen its grip. In classrooms, teachers found themselves pausing mid-lesson when Emily's name surfaced in history projects about local events. Students who had never known her felt an inexplicable chill, a quiet reverence for someone who had become more symbol than person. They studied her photographs, trying to reconcile the soft smile with the brutal end, struggling to understand how a life so ordinary could vanish so completely. At the diner where Emily once worked, the corner booth near the window remained untouched. New owners considered remodeling, replacing cracked vinyl and scratched tabletops, but something always stopped them. Customers still asked about her, still traced the outline of her memory in idle conversation, still left tips beneath folded napkins, as though she might return to collect them. Even the road where Reeves claimed to have driven that night took on a darker hue. Drivers slowed unconsciously as they passed the turnoff, glancing into the dense woods where snow and shadow concealed old secrets. The forest itself seemed altered, its silence heavier, its beauty more fragile. For investigators, the case became a study in regret and resolve. Across law enforcement agencies, the story circulated as a grim lesson in the cost of limitations, technological, procedural, and human. Conferences dissected every stage of the investigation, every misstep, every missed opportunity. Younger detectives listened intently, absorbing warnings etched in tragedy. New protocols were drafted. Old cold cases reopened. Evidence once thought worthless was subjected to modern scrutiny. In this way, Emily's story sparked a renewed determination to prevent future losses, to chase shadows with sharper tools, to never again let time become an accomplice. Yet, progress brought its own burden. As new cases surfaced, as new families faced the agony of uncertainty, the town was forced to confront a chilling reality. Emily was not alone. Her story was one thread in a vast, tangled tapestry of unresolved disappearances, unsolved murders, and lingering grief. Every breakthrough echoed with the question, how many others waited for answers that might never arrive? In quiet offices lit by computer screens and desk lamps, analysts pored over decades-old records, hunting patterns, mapping movements, seeking connections. They spoke of clusters, of corridors, of behavioral signatures. The language of modern criminology attempted to impose order on chaos, yet beneath the data lay a simple truth. Every case represented a life interrupted, a family altered forever. As these efforts unfolded, Daniel Reeves faded into obscurity, his name surfacing only in legal filings and occasional media retrospectives. In prison, his days fell into monotonous routine: roll call, meals, work detail, sleep. The world beyond the walls became distant, abstract, reduced to fragments glimpsed through narrow windows and rare conversations. Yet his mind remained captive to memory. He dreamed often of snow, of headlights, of a scarf fluttering across dark pavement. He woke drenched in sweat, heart racing, lungs burning, trapped in a loop he could not escape. In moments of wakeful despair, he wondered whether surrender had been an act of courage or cowardice, a final attempt to unburden himself rather than endure another decade of fear. He would never know. Meanwhile, the Carters faced a new challenge: learning how to live in a world where the central question of their lives had finally been answered. For 30 years, hope and uncertainty had shaped their existence. Every phone call, every knock at the door, every unidentified body discovered anywhere in the state reignited a fragile spark of possibility. Now that cycle had ended. There would be no miraculous return, no mistaken identity, no sudden reversal of fate. The finality was suffocating. Margaret found herself wandering grocery store aisles, forgetting what she needed, overwhelmed by an inexplicable sense of loss she thought she had long mastered. Thomas retreated into silence, spending hours in the garage, surrounded by half-finished projects, the steady rhythm of tools his only solace. Friends worried, offered support, suggested counseling. The Carters listened politely, thanked them, then returned to their quiet routines, navigating grief that felt simultaneously ancient and new. They began to travel more, visiting places Emily had once dreamed of seeing, lakes she had circled in magazines, cities she had marked in textbooks. In these journeys, they sought fragments of the future she had been denied, stitching together a life she would never live. At night, in unfamiliar hotel rooms, they spoke of her in soft tones, sharing memories they feared might fade. They recalled the way she used to tuck her hair behind one ear when nervous, the songs she sang off-key in the shower, the warmth of her hugs. In these stories, Emily lived again, if only briefly. Back home, the town slowly adapted to its altered identity. No longer merely a quiet Michigan community, it had become a landmark of unresolved history, a place synonymous with a tragedy that defied time. Visitors arrived, some respectful, others driven by morbid fascination. True crime enthusiasts wandered streets, photographing landmarks, whispering theories, tracing the path of a crime that had once unfolded invisibly. Their presence stirred unease. Residents resented the intrusion, yet understood the impulse. There was something magnetic about the idea that a single moment could echo across decades, reshaping countless lives. Local officials debated whether to discourage such attention or embrace it as a form of remembrance. In the end, they chose restraint, limiting publicity, preserving dignity. The memorial remained simple. The story, largely unadorned, because spectacle had no place here. And yet, the internet ensured that nothing truly faded. Podcasts dissected every detail. Documentaries reconstructed timelines. Online forums erupted with speculation, some accurate, others wildly misguided. Strangers debated motive, guilt, and morality, detached from the human cost, insulated by distance and anonymity. For the Carters, this digital afterlife of tragedy felt invasive, a second violation layered atop the first. They avoided social media, shielding themselves from the relentless analysis of their daughter's final hours. Still, fragments reached them. One night, Thomas stumbled upon a forum thread proposing alternate theories, casting doubt on Reeves' confession, suggesting conspiracies, accomplices, cover-ups. Rage surged through him, hot and sudden. He slammed the laptop shut, breath trembling, fury colliding with exhaustion. Some stories, he realized, would never be allowed to rest. As seasons turned, the landscape transformed. Spring softened the frozen ground. Summer bathed the town in warmth. Autumn scattered leaves across sidewalks once shadowed by fear. Each cycle reminded residents of time's relentless march, indifferent to human suffering. Yet, beneath these rhythms, the past remained present, woven into everyday existence. A passing siren still caused hearts to race. A missing child alert still froze blood. A lone scarf abandoned on a park bench still drew uneasy glances. Because the case had taught them a terrible lesson, that danger does not announce itself, that catastrophe can emerge from the most ordinary moments, that safety is always provisional. And in that awareness, the town found both vulnerability and strength. Parents spoke more openly with children about caution and awareness. Neighbors checked in on one another more frequently. Community events emphasized connection, shared responsibility, collective care. Slowly, a fragile resilience took shape, forged in the crucible of loss. In this way, Emily's memory became a quiet force for vigilance, her absence a catalyst for empathy. Still, in the darkest hours before dawn, when sleep faltered and the world lay hushed, residents sometimes imagined they heard footsteps on snow-dusted sidewalks, soft and tentative, as if someone were walking home. And in those moments, the old ache resurfaced, sharp and sudden, reminding them that while justice had spoken, time had taken far more than it could ever return. Because the true cost of the cold case was not measured in court verdicts or headlines. It was measured in empty bedrooms, in uncelebrated birthdays, in futures that would never unfold. And in that enduring silence, the town carried forward, forever changed, haunted not only by what had happened, but by what might have been. The deeper investigators revisited the past, the more unsettling the picture became, not because of what they found, but because of what they had missed. Old case files, once considered exhausted, began to whisper new possibilities. Margins filled with hastily scribbled notes hinted at fleeting suspicions. Interview logs revealed patterns never fully explored. Fragments of testimony, dismissed as unreliable or contradictory, suddenly aligned with chilling precision. In the early weeks following Reeves' confession, a small team of detectives was tasked with reconstructing the investigation from its earliest hours, not to assign blame, but to understand. What emerged was a portrait of chaos, confusion, and overwhelming scale, a small-town police force abruptly thrust into a nightmare far beyond its experience. The first 48 hours had been a blur of urgency and panic. Tips flooded in faster than they could be processed. Officers worked double shifts, subsisting on coffee and adrenaline, racing against time they didn't yet realize they were losing. In the absence of modern technology, each lead required physical pursuit, each rumor a drive across frozen backroads, each possibility another fragile hope. In this frenzy, critical details slipped through unseen. One witness had reported a man matching Reeves' description lingering near the intersection days before Emily disappeared. Another recalled a delivery truck idling in the same area on multiple occasions. At the time, these observations seemed unremarkable. Delivery drivers were common. Strangers passed through town daily. There was nothing concrete, nothing to grasp. But hindsight transformed these details into something haunting. Because the signs had been there. They had simply failed to coalesce. This realization haunted the detectives assigned to the review. Not because it implied incompetence, but because it revealed the brutal truth of investigation, that clarity often arrives only after it is no longer useful. Patterns emerge only when the story has already ended. As they reconstructed Reeves' movements, a disturbing familiarity surfaced. He had passed through dozens of similar towns across Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, his routes weaving an invisible network through rural landscapes. In each place, he remained unremarkable, just another driver passing through, leaving no impression, no trace. It raised an unspoken question. Was Emily truly his only victim? No evidence suggested otherwise. No matching cold cases, no comparable disappearances, no forensic links. Yet doubt lingered, heavy and persistent. Detectives quietly cross-referenced his employment history against unsolved crimes across the region. They reviewed missing persons reports. They studied timelines, searching for patterns that might reveal a broader truth. Nothing definitive emerged. And yet, uncertainty remained. Because monsters rarely confine themselves to a single act. For the town, this possibility reopened old fears, stirring anxieties that had barely begun to settle. Parents who had cautiously relaxed their vigilance tightened it once more. Late-night footsteps echoed louder. Unknown vehicles drew wary glances. Trust, so fragile to begin with, retreated deeper into caution. At community meetings, residents voiced questions that had no answers. Could Reeves have acted alone? Could someone have known? Could there be other victims still waiting for names, for justice, for recognition? Officials responded carefully, urging restraint, emphasizing the absence of evidence. But reassurance rang hollow in the wake of a truth so long concealed. In the Carter home, these whispers of uncertainty landed heavily. Margaret found herself replaying the past with new intensity, searching for signs she might have missed, moments that now seemed freighted with meaning. She recalled Emily mentioning a man who made her uncomfortable at work, a customer who lingered too long, who asked too many questions. At the time, they had brushed it aside. Now, every detail pulsed with renewed urgency. But there were no answers. Only echoes. As the investigation expanded, so too did the emotional toll. Detectives assigned to the review described vivid dreams, insomnia, a creeping sense of unease. Immersed in decades-old trauma, they absorbed the sorrow, the frustration, the unanswered questions that had lingered for years. Some requested reassignment. Others pressed forward, driven by a sense of obligation to the dead and the living alike. In one forgotten evidence locker, they uncovered a box containing personal items recovered near the burial site, fragments of fabric, rusted buttons, soil-stained shoelaces. Objects once, too, degraded to matter. Now, subjected to modern analysis, they yielded microscopic clues, traces of pollen, mineral residue, fibers that aligned eerily with Reeves' confession. Each confirmation brought grim satisfaction, yet also sharpened the pain. Proof did not heal. It merely affirmed loss. Beyond law enforcement, the case began influencing broader discussions about criminal justice, technology, and time. Legal scholars debated the reliability of delayed confessions. Psychologists analyzed the weight of long-buried guilt. Sociologists examined the communal impact of unresolved violence. Emily's story became a reference point, a cautionary tale, a reminder of the human cost embedded within cold statistics. For the Carters, this academic attention felt distant, almost surreal. Their world remained small, defined by absence and memory. Yet they understood the importance of these conversations. If their daughter's death could help prevent even one future tragedy, then some measure of meaning might be salvaged from the wreckage. They agreed to speak at conferences, at schools, at community forums. Their voices, once silenced by grief, grew steadier with time. They spoke not of horror, but of vigilance. Not of fear, but of awareness. They urged parents to listen, to notice, to trust instinct. They encouraged young people to speak up, to seek help, to reject the normalization of discomfort. In these moments, Emily's presence felt near, not as a ghost, but as a purpose. Yet, even as the town sought to transform pain into resolve, darkness lingered at its edges. One winter evening, a false confession arrived at the police station. A man claimed responsibility, weaving a narrative that unraveled within hours. Another followed weeks later, then another. Each forced investigators to reopen emotional wounds, to sift through lies in search of truth. It became clear that tragedy exerts a magnetic pull, drawing in the unstable, the lonely, the attention-starved. Each false confession reignited speculation, reignited doubt, reignited fear. And so, the town learned to endure not just memory but intrusion. At night, when snow blanketed the streets and the wind whispered through bare branches, residents locked their doors and listened. They listened for sirens, for footsteps, for anything out of place. The silence itself became a language, speaking of vigilance and vulnerability. Years slipped past. Children born after the confession grew up hearing Emily's name as part of local history, a cautionary tale folded into bedtime warnings and school assemblies. To them, the tragedy felt distant, almost mythic, yet its imprint shaped their understanding of safety and trust. For older residents, the wound remained closer, more intimate. They carried images of candlelit vigils and frozen search parties, of desperate hope and unbearable disappointment. These memories surfaced in unexpected moments, a familiar song on the radio, a scarf in a store window, a teenage girl walking home alone. And always, the same question lingered, unspoken yet insistent. How could this have happened here? The answer, though uncomfortable, had become unavoidable. Because evil does not require extraordinary circumstances. It requires only opportunity. And opportunity exists everywhere. As the years following Reeves' conviction accumulated, the town's relationship with the past evolved. The memorial at Pine and Mercer weathered seasons of rain and snow, its metal plaque dulled by time. Yet flowers continued to appear. Notes continued to be left. Candles continued to flicker on anniversaries, small flames defying darkness. These gestures were not acts of mourning alone. They were acts of resistance. A refusal to allow memory to fade. A declaration that Emily Carter would not be reduced to a statistic, a case number, a footnote in true crime history. She would remain a presence. A warning. A legacy. And in that legacy, the town discovered a fragile form of hope. Because while the past could not be rewritten, the future could still be shaped. In classrooms, teachers spoke more openly about empathy and awareness. In households, parents encouraged conversation rather than silence. In neighborhoods, people watched out for one another, understanding that community itself was a form of protection. It was not enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And in a world where certainty had been stripped away, something was all they had. So life continued, cautious yet persistent, shadowed by memory yet driven by resilience. Beneath every snowfall, beneath every quiet night, the echo of a single story remained, whispering its warning into the fabric of everyday life. A reminder that the past is never truly past, that truth can hide for decades, and that sometimes the most devastating revelations arrive not in a moment of chaos, but in the stillness of a confession, spoken too late to save, yet just in time to remember. As the years passed, the story of Emily Carter drifted beyond the borders of Michigan, carried outward by documentaries, podcasts, investigative books, and late-night radio segments that spoke her name into the dark. Her case became emblematic of something larger, a symbol of how time can both bury and resurrect truth, how silence can stretch across decades before finally shattering. For strangers, it was a mystery to be dissected, analyzed, debated. For the town, it was a living wound. Each retelling reopened scars, forcing residents to confront memories they had tried to soften. Old emotions surged unpredictably. Anger, sorrow, guilt, fear, all resurfaced in waves, colliding with the present. The story refused to settle into history. It insisted on remaining alive. High school students began researching the case for class projects. They interviewed former detectives, neighbors, teachers who had known Emily. They walked the same streets she had walked, stood at the same corner where her scarf was found, visited the memorial in uneasy silence. Many were struck by how ordinary everything looked. That ordinariness disturbed them most, because it meant there was no dramatic backdrop, no ominous setting, no warning sign etched into the environment. Evil had not announced itself with thunder or shadow. It had slipped quietly into a familiar night and vanished just as silently. For these students, the case reshaped their understanding of safety. They grew more cautious, more observant, more aware of subtle changes in behavior, unfamiliar patterns, fleeting discomforts. Teachers noticed a shift in classroom discussions, more questions about psychology, justice, ethics, and responsibility. In this way, Emily's story continued to teach. Not through fear alone, but through awareness. Meanwhile, the broader true crime community fixated on Daniel Reeves. Analysts dissected his confession frame by frame, word by word, tone by tone. Some argued his remorse was genuine. Others suggested calculated self-interest. A few insisted he sought redemption, while skeptics proposed he feared exposure by advancing technology. The truth remained elusive, because human motivation rarely submits to clean explanation. In prison, Reeves withdrew further into himself, declining interviews, refusing media requests, rarely speaking even to guards. His letters went unanswered. His family severed contact. The world he once inhabited collapsed into a narrow corridor of concrete and steel, punctuated only by the relentless echo of memory. In moments of isolation, he replayed his life, tracing the sequence of choices that led him to that frozen night. Each reflection ended the same way, with an unbridgeable gulf between what was and what might have been. No path forward offered redemption, only endurance. Yet even endurance proved fragile. In his 6th year of incarceration, Reeves attempted suicide. Guards found him unconscious, his breathing shallow, his pulse faint. He survived, but the incident rippled quietly through the system, stirring uncomfortable questions about punishment, remorse, and the psychological toll of long-delayed confession. Some argued his suffering was deserved. Others saw it as a tragic inevitability. For the Carters, the news stirred complicated emotions. Margaret wept, not for Reeves, but for the irretrievable years lost to silence. Thomas felt only a hollow resignation. Whatever pain Reeves experienced could never equal the devastation inflicted upon their family. Yet neither wished him further harm. They had learned, through years of grief, that hatred consumed more than it healed. As winter turned to spring, The woods where Emily was found bloomed with fragile life. Wildflowers pushed through soil once scarred by violence. Birds nested among branches that had once concealed horror. Nature, indifferent to human sorrow, continued its cycles, offering beauty without apology. Visitors left small bouquets near the site, tucking them gently into the undergrowth. They whispered prayers, apologies, promises. The forest absorbed these offerings silently, its shadows deep, its stillness profound. In the town, life persisted. New businesses opened. Old ones closed. Families moved in and out. Children grew taller. Seasons blurred together. Yet the case lingered in subtle ways, shaping instinct, guiding behavior, sharpening perception. Parents walked their children to school longer than necessary. Teenagers shared locations with friends. Neighbors checked in on one another after dark. These habits became second nature, woven seamlessly into daily life, invisible to outsiders, yet deeply ingrained. And in this vigilance, the town found a fragile equilibrium. One evening, during a community gathering marking the anniversary of Emily's disappearance, an elderly man approached the podium. His hands trembled as he gripped the microphone. He introduced himself as a former factory worker who had lived near Pine Street in 1992. For decades, he said, he had carried a memory that troubled him. On the night Emily vanished, he had noticed a delivery truck idling near the intersection. He had glanced at the driver, a young man with dark hair, staring intently at the sidewalk. Something about the moment unsettled him, but he dismissed it, thought nothing of it, went home. For 30 years, that memory had haunted him. His voice cracked as he spoke. "I keep wondering," he said, "if I'd called it and if I'd said something, would she still be alive?" Silence engulfed the room. There was no answer, only the unbearable weight of possibility. Margaret rose slowly from her seat and crossed the aisle. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch gentle, forgiving. "You didn't know," she said softly. "None of us knew." Her words, simple yet profound, rippled outward, easing the tension, offering fragile solace. They reminded everyone present that blame could not resurrect the dead, that guilt, though natural, often settled where it did not belong. Yet the question lingered. What if? It echoed through countless memories, through half-forgotten moments, through fleeting decisions that now seemed monumental. In this way, the case reshaped how the town understood accountability, how it weighed instinct, how it valued vigilance. And so, they learned to speak up, to trust discomfort, to question silence. Slowly, painfully, these lessons took root, altering behavior, reshaping culture. Across the state, other communities took notice. Emily's story appeared in training modules for law enforcement, in educational curricula, in public awareness campaigns. Her name became shorthand for the dangers of complacency, the cost of hesitation, the necessity of collective responsibility. Through this transformation, her life, though cut short, gained a haunting influence. She became a voice, a warning, a presence that refused to fade. Yet even as her legacy expanded, the Carters remained anchored in the personal. For them, Emily was not a symbol. She was a daughter, a child whose laughter once filled their kitchen, a teenager who left notes on the refrigerator, a young woman whose absence still echoed through empty rooms. They continued their travels, visiting places she had dreamed of. They scattered small tokens, a ribbon here, a note there, gestures of remembrance scattered across the map, as though building a constellation of her presence across the world. In these journeys, they found fleeting peace. Not closure, never closure, but moments of connection. One evening, standing beside a lake in northern Michigan, watching sunset ripple across the water, Margaret whispered, "She would have loved this." Thomas nodded. And for a moment, the world felt gentler. Yet beneath even these moments, the shadow of the past persisted, reminding them that grief does not end. It evolves. It softens. It transforms. But it never disappears. As the town moved deeper into the years following the confession, The story of Emily Carter settled into a strange duality, both distant and immediate, both history and living memory. It existed in plaques and headlines, in whispered conversations and silent reflections. And in that space between remembrance and forgetting, the town discovered a fragile truth. Some stories are not meant to fade. They are meant to endure, to warn,
to teach,
to remind. Because in remembering, we resist repetition. And in resistance, we honor the lives that were taken too soon. So, beneath Michigan skies that darkened and brightened with the passing seasons, Emily's name continued to drift on the wind, carried through streets and forests, through classrooms and homes, through generations who would never meet her yet would never forget her. A single life, a single moment, an echo that would never fully fall silent. Night fell over the city like a heavy shroud. The yellow streetlights reflected off the rain-soaked pavement, stretching into trembling, distorted streaks of light. Inside the cramped homicide office, only the glow of Lamb's desk lamp remained. He sat motionless before a thick stack of case files, his fingers tapping lightly against the wooden surface, steady and tense, like a strained heartbeat. An old USB drive lay beside the documents. Inside it was the data they had just extracted from the dead warehouse guard's computer. A deleted video, painstakingly restored by the tech team. Lamb inhaled deeply and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, revealing a blurry, dimly lit room. The camera shook slightly, as if the person holding it were extremely nervous. Then a face emerged in the weak light. Not the victim, not their main suspect, but a middle-aged man in a dark coat, sharp features, eyes as cold as steel. Lamb froze. "It can't be," he whispered.
It was Kai.
A former detective. A legend who had left the force 15 years ago after a scandal so severe that the file was permanently sealed. Kai had once been a brilliant investigator, solving dozens of seemingly impossible cases. But his name also became forever linked to a mysterious disappearance, a key suspect who vanished without a trace after a final interrogation. After that, Kai resigned and faded from every official record. And now he had resurfaced in a video tied to this cold case. On the screen, Kai's voice was low and controlled. "If you're watching this, it means I failed. Everything is far more complicated than we ever imagined. The one behind it all is not just a single person. It's an entire network." The video cut off abruptly. No explanation. No concrete clues. Only a chilling warning. Lamb leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. In his mind, fragments of the 15-year-old case began to rearrange themselves. Details once dismissed. Contradictory statements. Strange investigative decisions. Kai's shadow loomed over them all. The office door swung open. Mai stepped in, a fresh report in her hands. "We just got the final lab results," she said quickly. The fingerprints on the lighter matched Kai. The air seemed to freeze. Lamb opened his eyes and met her gaze. In that moment, he understood that this investigation had crossed a line. It was no longer just about solving an old murder. It was about confronting a buried past. They reopened every file connected to Kai. Old reports, notebooks, audio recordings. The deeper they dug, the more distorted the picture became. Kai had once gotten dangerously close to an underground organization that traded in information, fixed cases, and manipulated investigations. But before he could expose them, he suddenly quit and vanished. Some former colleagues believed he had been bought off. Others were convinced he was playing a far more dangerous game. And now, his traces lay at the very heart of this cold case. That night, Lamb didn't go home. Alone in the archive room, he stood before a massive board covered with photographs, diagrams, and tangled red strings. At the center, he pinned an old photo of Kai. Under the cold fluorescent light, the man's face seemed to stare back at him, unreadable, unfathomable. "Who are you in this story?" Lamb murmured. "A traitor or the final gatekeeper?" Outside, thunder rolled, tearing through the dark sky. A storm was coming, and with it, Secrets buried for 15 years were about to be dragged into the light, no matter the cost. The address arrived just before dawn, transmitted through an encrypted channel that had been dormant for more than a decade. No sender, no signature, just a set of coordinates and a time. 6:30 a.m. Lamb stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. He didn't need to be told who it was from.
Kai.
The drive out of the city was silent, the roads slick with leftover rain, the sky a pale, uncertain gray. Factories and abandoned warehouses drifted past like skeletal monuments to forgotten labor. The coordinates led them to a derelict industrial complex on the edge of Lake Huron, a place long erased from official maps, swallowed by rust and weeds. The wind cut through Lamb's coat as he stepped out of the car. The massive steel doors of the central building stood half open, creaking softly. Inside, shadows stretched endlessly, broken only by narrow beams of morning light slicing through shattered windows. Each step echoed. Every sound felt amplified. At the far end of the hall, a single lamp glowed, and beneath it stood Kai. Time had not spared him. His hair had turned completely white, his face carved with deep lines, but his eyes remained sharp, piercing, alert. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not run. He simply waited. "You came alone," Kai said quietly. "I brought the truth," Lamb replied. Kai nodded once. "Then listen carefully, because after today, nothing can be undone." The silence between them felt heavy, electric. "I didn't kill her," Kai said, "but I buried the path that would have led to her killer." Lamb felt the words strike like a physical blow. "Why?" "Because the truth would have destroyed everything." Kai turned and began walking deeper into the building. Against every instinct, Lamb followed. In a narrow room lined with decaying file cabinets, Kai stopped and switched on a projector. Images flooded the cracked wall: surveillance footage, financial records, transcripts, internal police communications, all stitched together like a monstrous puzzle. "This wasn't just a murder," Kai said. "It was a transaction." The victim had stumbled upon a clandestine network operating inside law enforcement itself. Officers, prosecutors, forensic specialists, all tied together by bribery, blackmail, and quiet disappearances. Evidence vanished. Suspects died. Cases collapsed. Justice was auctioned to the highest bidder. "And she tried to expose them," Lamb whispered. "She gathered proof. Names. Payments.
Routes.
She planned to publish everything." Kai paused, his voice tightening. They intercepted her. But they didn't just silence her. They used her death to send a message. A warning. Anyone who looked too closely would be erased. "I identified the man who ordered it," Kai continued. "But arresting him would have detonated the entire system. Judges.
Chiefs.
Politicians. The city would have burned." "So you let a killer walk free," Lamb said, his voice trembling with controlled rage. Kai turned to him slowly. "I traded one life for thousands." Silence crashed between them.
"Who?"
Lamb demanded. "Who gave the order?" Kai hesitated. "Just a second." "Then, your father." The words shattered the air. Lamb staggered back, his mind reeling. "My father died when I was 12. "He didn't die," Kai said softly. "He disappeared. The network relocated him. New identity. New life. That was his payment for loyalty." Every memory Lamb had of his childhood detonated at once. The sudden departure, the closed casket funeral, the sealed documents, the unanswered questions. "You're lying." "I wish I were." Kai reached into his coat and produced a faded photograph. A man stood beside a lakeside cabin, older, heavier, but unmistakably the same face. Lamb's knees nearly buckled. "He's alive," Kai said, "and he still controls the network." The truth surged like poison through Lamb's veins. "Why tell me now?" "Because the system is collapsing. Too many leaks. Too many ghosts coming back. They will kill him. They will kill you. And they will erase this entire story forever." Kai stepped closer. "I protected the truth for 15 years. Now it's your turn to decide whether it deserves to live. Footsteps echoed suddenly in the corridor. Too many. Too fast. Kai's expression hardened. They're here. Gunfire exploded through the air. Glass shattered. Concrete burst. Bullets tore through the walls. Kai shoved Lam aside, dragging him behind a steel support beam as armed figures stormed the building. They traced the transmission, Kai hissed. They can't let us leave alive. Smoke and dust filled the room. Alarms wailed somewhere in the complex. Shadows flickered between muzzle flashes. Kai pushed a data drive into Lam's hand. Everything is here, he said. Names. Transactions. Safe houses. Your father's location. Lam locked eyes with him. Come with me. Kai shook his head. This ends with me. Before Lam could react, Kai rose from cover and stepped into the gunfire. The shots rang out, deafening, brutal, final. Kai collapsed. The shooting stopped. For a moment, everything was still. Then sirens echoed in the distance. Lam ran. Through smoke, through blood, through collapsing corridors, clutching the drive that carried 15 years of buried truth. Behind him, the warehouse burned. Ahead of him, a reckoning waited. Because now, the final mystery remained. Not who killed her, but whether the truth could survive its own revelation. And somewhere out there, a man who should have been dead for decades was still pulling the strings. The final hunt had begun. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of wet asphalt cutting through fields swallowed by fog. Lam drove without headlights, guided only by the faint glow of the dashboard and the tremor in his own breathing. Every mile felt like a countdown. In the rearview mirror, darkness chased him, thick and merciless, as if the night itself were hunting. In his pocket, the data drive burned like a living thing. Kai's final sacrifice replayed again and again in his mind. The flash of gunfire, the sudden stillness, the blood blooming across concrete. There had been no time for grief. Only motion. Only survival. Because now, the truth was no longer just dangerous. It was lethal. By the time Lam reached the safe house, dawn was bleeding slowly into the sky. The building was an abandoned ranger station buried deep in the northern forests, a place that hadn't appeared on any official registry in decades. Kai had prepared it long ago, a contingency for a day he clearly believed would come. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold metal. A generator hummed softly, feeding power to a single laptop bolted to a steel desk. Lam plugged in the drive. Files spilled across the screen, thousands of documents, layered encryption, hidden partitions within hidden partitions. It took hours just to map the architecture of the archive. But gradually, the structure emerged. This was not just evidence. It was a blueprint of corruption. The network operated like a shadow government, embedded inside law enforcement, courts, and municipal offices across 3 states. Payments disguised as consulting fees. Shell companies funneling bribes. Evidence warehouses where seized materials were altered, replaced, or destroyed. At the center, a single name appeared again and again. Daniel Mercer, Lam's father. According to the records, Mercer had once been a decorated investigator before vanishing under mysterious circumstances. But the truth was far darker. He had orchestrated the transformation of a loose collection of dirty cops into a disciplined, nearly invisible machine. He didn't just exploit the system. He redesigned it. And for 3 decades, he had remained untouchable. Until now. A location blinked on the screen: Superior National Forest, Minnesota. A cabin. Remote. Isolated. Invisible. The hunt had a destination. The forest swallowed the road. Pines towered overhead, their branches locking together like a cathedral ceiling, blocking out the sky. Snow began to fall, thick and relentless, erasing tracks almost as quickly as they formed. By the time Lam reached the coordinates, night had returned. The cabin stood alone, crouched against the trees, a single warm window glowing faintly in the darkness. Lam approached silently, weapon raised, heart pounding. Through the glass, he saw him. Older, broader,
Slower.
but unmistakable. His father sat at a wooden table, a radio crackling softly beside him, a glass of whiskey trembling slightly in his hand. For a moment, the years collapsed. Lamb saw not the architect of a criminal empire, but the man who had taught him to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to trust in justice. Then the memories fractured. He kicked the door in. Daniel Mercer didn't reach for a gun. He didn't flinch. He simply looked up. "I wondered how long it would take," he said calmly.
Why?
Lamb demanded. Mercer exhaled slowly. "Because the world isn't saved by rules. It's controlled by leverage." He gestured to the chair opposite him.
Seat.
"Before they find us."
They already are, Lamb said.
"That's why we have minutes, not hours." The cabin groaned as wind tore through the trees. "I didn't order her death," Mercer said. "I authorized it." The distinction landed like a blade. She was going to dismantle everything. Courts would have collapsed. Convicts would have walked. Riots. Vigilantes.
Anarchy.
I chose stability. You chose power. Power is stability. Lamb slammed his fist against the wall. You murdered an innocent woman. I prevented 1,000 murders that would have followed. Silence stretched between them.
They'll kill you, Lamb said.
Mercer nodded.
Yes.
The network no longer needs me. That's the cost of control. Then help me end it. Mercer studied his son, eyes softening. I already did. He slid a second drive across the table. This contains the fail-safes. Dead man switches. Financial triggers.
Exposure chains.
If anything happens to me, everything goes public.
Stay.
Why give this to me? Because I don't trust anyone else to decide when the world is ready to know. Footsteps crunched outside. Voices murmured. Flashlights pierced the walls. They're here, Mercer said. Lamb raised his weapon. Come with me. Mercer shook his head. This story needs an ending, not an escape. Gunfire erupted. Windows shattered. Mercer shoved Lamb through a rear door into the forest. Run, he whispered. The cabin exploded in flames seconds later. Lamb vanished into the snow, clutching 2 drives, one carrying the truth of the past, the other holding the future of justice itself. Behind him, the ghost of his father burned. Ahead, an impossible decision waited. Because revealing the truth would destroy institutions. Hiding it would preserve lies. And either choice would change the world forever. The forest swallowed him whole. Snow whipped sideways through the trees, erasing every trace of his passage, muffling the echoes of the explosion that still thundered in his chest. Lamb ran until his lungs burned, until the cold sliced through muscle and bone, until the world narrowed to breath, pain, and instinct. When he finally collapsed behind a fallen pine, the night pressed down with suffocating weight. Behind him, the cabin burned like a dying star, its flames licking the sky before collapsing into darkness. With it vanished the last physical trace of his father, a man who had shaped the machinery of justice and corruption with equal precision, now reduced to ash and unanswered questions. Lamb lay still, heart hammering, eyes fixed on the drifting snow. The hunt was not over. It had merely changed direction. By the time he reached the extraction point, dawn had begun to fracture the horizon. The frozen lake shimmered under pale light, its surface cracked like shattered glass. A small seaplane waited silently at the edge, its engine already humming, prepared for a flight that did not officially exist. Mai stood beside it. Her eyes widened when she saw him emerge from the trees, bloodied, exhausted, alive. They didn't speak. There was no need. She pulled him inside. The plane lifted off moments later, slicing through the fog, carrying with it 2 data drives that could ignite a political firestorm. Safe houses blurred into one another. Encrypted networks activated. Journalists, federal investigators, international watchdog groups. All were quietly alerted, fed fragments of data just large enough to verify authenticity, not enough to reveal the whole truth. The strategy was surgical.
No explosión.
Only a slow, unstoppable collapse. Within 48 hours, resignations rippled through police departments across 3 states. Judges were placed under investigation. Prosecutors vanished into legal silence. Bank accounts froze. Corporations folded overnight. Shell companies evaporated. The network began to devour itself. Those who had built their power on secrecy now drowned beneath its exposure. But the central mystery remained. The murder that had started everything. The cold case. Hidden within Mercer's final archive was a locked partition labeled only with a date, October 17, 1992. It took 26 hours to crack. When it opened, the room fell silent. Inside was the confession. Not a recorded statement. A psychological profile. A pattern analysis. A reconstruction so precise it bordered on prophecy. The killer was not a criminal syndicate enforcer. Not a hired gun. Not a professional. He was a patrol officer. A man whose name had appeared briefly in the original investigation, then quietly vanished. Thomas Hale. 28 years old at the time. Recently divorced. Financially drowning. Deep in gambling debt. His service record spotless. His psychological evaluations marked stable. Too stable. The files detailed how Hale had been approached, manipulated, pressured. How he had been fed false evidence, made to believe the victim was an internal informant selling police secrets to violent gangs. How fear and loyalty had been weaponized until murder felt like duty. The final entry was chillingly simple. He believed he was saving lives. Hale had died in a car accident 2 years after the murder. Drunk. Alone. The truth had died with him. Until now. When the findings went public, the reaction was immediate and violent. Families demanded justice. Cities erupted in protest. Trust in law enforcement plummeted overnight. For weeks, the nation existed in a state of raw exposure, forced to confront how easily systems designed to protect could be twisted into weapons. But amid the chaos, something else emerged. A reckoning. New oversight laws passed at record speed. Independent review boards gained unprecedented authority. Cold cases across the country were reopened, re-examined, reborn. The past was no longer buried. It was interrogated. And yet, for Lamb, there was no victory. Only aftermath. He returned to the warehouse where it had begun, now a sealed crime scene, wrapped in warning tape, its walls scarred by fire and bullets. The air still smelled faintly of smoke and metal. Here, Kai had fallen. Here, the truth had been handed over in blood. Lamb stood alone in the silence, listening to the echo of a city finally beginning to breathe again. Somewhere, families were learning the truth about their loved ones. Somewhere, old lies were collapsing. Somewhere, justice was waking from a long, enforced sleep. But closure remained elusive. Because answers did not undo death. They did not erase loss. They only illuminated it. In the final report, the case was officially closed. Michigan 1992 cold case unraveled. Confession ends 30-year mystery. The headline flashed across every screen, every paper, every language. But behind the words, the story remained infinitely more complex. A woman silenced for uncovering a hidden empire. A detective who sacrificed his life to resurrect the truth. A father who built and burned a kingdom of shadows. And a son who carried the unbearable weight of exposing them all. On a quiet morning months later, Lamb stood beside a nameless grave at the edge of a forgotten cemetery.
No markers.
No flowers. Just frozen earth and bare trees. Kai's resting place. There's no monument, Mai said softly beside him. Lamb shook his head. There shouldn't be. Some heroes don't need to be remembered. They need to be understood. The wind whispered through the branches. The sky hung heavy with unshed snow. As they turned to leave, Lamb felt the familiar pull of unfinished stories, the countless cold cases still buried in archives, waiting for someone to listen. Because every unsolved crime leaves behind a wound in time. And some wounds never fully close. They linger. They ache. They demand to be seen. And in that lingering silence, in that unresolved space between justice and loss, the echoes of 1992 would continue to breathe, a reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way back into the light. The world moved on, because it always did. Headlines faded. News cycles shifted. New disasters, new scandals, new tragedies took their place. The name of the case slowly slipped from the front pages, sinking into archives and databases, into the quiet digital cemeteries where history is stored and forgotten. But for those who had lived inside the story, nothing ever truly ended. For Lamb, the nights remained the hardest. Sleep came in fragments.
A few minutes at a time.
Shallow, unstable, haunted by echoes of gunfire, by burning cabins, by faces that no longer existed anywhere but inside his memory. In the silence of early morning, he often lay staring at the ceiling, listening to the city breathe, waiting for the weight in his chest to loosen. It never did, because closure, he had learned, was a myth. Truth did not heal. It only replaced confusion with pain. The task force disbanded quietly. Some officers transferred. Some retired early. Some vanished into administrative obscurity, unable to remain inside institutions they no longer trusted. The system had survived, but it would never look the same again. New safeguards were installed. New oversight mechanisms built. New ethical frameworks introduced. Yet beneath all of it lingered the awareness that corruption had once thrived in the very structures designed to prevent it. And that awareness could never be erased. Mai took a teaching position at the academy, training young investigators, drilling into them the importance of doubt, of skepticism, of never trusting any narrative that seemed too clean, too convenient. Her lectures became legendary, raw, unfiltered accounts of the case, stripped of heroism, stripped of comfort. Truth, she told them, is not a destination. It is a responsibility, and sometimes it will destroy you. They listened in absolute silence. Lamb stayed in the field, not because he wanted to, but because he no longer knew how to exist outside the hunt. Cold cases began arriving from across the region, then from across the country. Families who had lost hope. Investigators who had reached dead ends. Departments too afraid to reopen files that might expose their own past mistakes. Lamb took them all. Every photograph. Every bloodstain. Every unanswered question. Each case became a thread, and slowly, meticulously, he began weaving new patterns from old tragedies. Some cases cracked open within days. Others resisted for months. A few never yielded at all. But each investigation reminded him why the truth had to be pursued, no matter the cost. Because silence was the final accomplice. Late one night, alone in his office, Lamb received an unmarked envelope. No return address.
No postie.
Just his name, typed in precise, mechanical lettering. Inside was a single sheet of paper.
3 lines.
A set of coordinates.
A date.
And a phrase. You don't know the whole story. The chill that crawled up his spine was immediate. The network had collapsed. The confessions had been verified. The system had burned itself out.
And yet,
somewhere, something still lingered. A remainder. A residue of darkness that had not been fully consumed. Lamb folded the paper slowly, sliding it into his pocket. The hunt was not finished. The coordinates led to a forgotten stretch of coastline, where industrial ruins leaned into the sea like rotting skeletons. Rusted cranes loomed overhead. Broken concrete jutted from the sand. Waves crashed endlessly, indifferent, relentless. Buried beneath one of the collapsed loading docks, investigators uncovered a sealed steel container. Inside, human remains.
A man. Bound. Shot.
Wrapped in plastic. The forensics team worked in silence. When the identification came back, Lamb felt the breath leave his lungs. Thomas Hale. The patrol officer. The supposed killer. The man who, according to the official narrative, had died in a drunken car accident decades earlier. But here he was. Executed.
Buried.
Erased. The confession, the psychological profile, the reconstructed motive, all of it suddenly twisted into something far more sinister. Hale had not died. He had been silenced, which meant he had talked. And if he had talked, then someone else had acted. Someone still alive. The revelation tore open every assumption they had made. New task forces formed overnight. Old evidence resurfaced. The timeline fractured. What had once seemed like a closed story now unraveled into a far larger, far darker tapestry. Because Hale had not acted alone. He had been controlled. And those who controlled him had not all burned with Mercer. Some had escaped. Some had adapted. Some had disappeared so completely they no longer officially existed.
Ghosts.
Operating in spaces too quiet to detect. Too powerful to confront directly. Threats began arriving. Subtle. Elegant. Dead flowers on doorsteps. Voicemails with nothing but breathing. Encrypted messages containing fragments of personal information that no stranger should have possessed. Someone was watching, waiting, calculating. The war had merely shifted underground. One evening, as rain soaked the city in cold silver streaks, Lamb stood alone on the roof of the precinct, staring out across the skyline. Below him, millions of lives unfolded, unaware, unprotected, hopeful. Somewhere in that vast sprawl, predators still moved. The thought no longer terrified him. It anchored him, because as long as shadows existed, so would the need for those willing to step into them. He exhaled slowly and turned back toward the stairwell. Months later, a new file landed on his desk. No case number, no jurisdiction, just a single phrase stamped in red across the front. Cold case, active. Inside, dozens of photographs spilled out missing persons, unidentified bodies, unresolved homicides stretching back 40 years. At the bottom lay a note, handwritten this time. You opened the first door. Now walk through the rest. Lamb closed the folder. Outside, thunder rolled. Another storm. Another descent into the unknown. Because in the end, this was the true legacy of the Michigan 1992 cold case. Not closure, not justice, but awakening. A permanent reminder that beneath every solved mystery, countless others still waited. Watching, breathing, enduring. And somewhere in the silence between past and present, the unresolved continued to whisper, demanding to be heard, demanding to be hunted, demanding, always, to be brought into the light. The file did not feel like paper. It felt like weight. A gravity that bent the air around it, that distorted time, that pulled every thought toward its center. Lamb carried it through the precinct like a sealed wound, past rows of flickering fluorescent lights, past desks cluttered with cold coffee and half-written reports, past faces that glanced up briefly and then away, unaware that another storm had just been born. Inside his office, he locked the door. Only then did he open the folder. Photographs spilled across the desk, grainy surveillance stills, faded family portraits, autopsy images blurred by age, missing person flyers yellowed at the edges. Faces stared back at him, some young, some old, some frozen mid-smile, some hollowed by fear. Each one a story that had ended too abruptly, too quietly, too completely. The cases spanned decades. Different states, different jurisdictions, different methods. Yet threaded through them all was a single pattern: disappearance without explanation, evidence misfiled, leads abruptly abandoned, witnesses recanting under unexplained pressure. And beneath that pattern, a deeper truth began to surface. These were not isolated failures. They were coordinated erasures. The deeper Lamb dug, the more the architecture of a second network revealed itself. Older, quieter, far more disciplined than Mercer's empire. Where Mercer's structure had relied on leverage and money, this one thrived on ideology, belief, control. Its members did not see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as custodians, guardians of social order, architects of stability. They decided which crimes deserved to be solved, which truths deserved to survive, which lives could be sacrificed for the greater narrative. Their signature was absence. No noise, no spectacle, just silence. And now that silence was cracking. A name surfaced repeatedly in the hidden communications. Not a person, a designation. The curator. No photograph, no official identity. Only directives, transmitted through layered encryption, routed across shell servers scattered across 3 continents. Orders without authors. Commands without faces. And beneath each directive, a familiar phrase. Preserve the balance. Lamb leaned back slowly, the weight of realization pressing against his chest. Mercer had not been the top of the pyramid. He had been a node. A powerful one, but still expendable. The true architects had remained untouched, unexposed, watching as his empire collapsed, adapting, recalibrating, preparing for what came next. And now they were watching Lamb. The first attempt came quietly. A routine traffic stop. A flicker of police lights in his rearview mirror. The officer's hands trembling slightly as he approached. License. Registration. A brief pause. Then a whispered warning, barely audible through the open window. Stop digging. The officer stepped back, returned to his vehicle, and drove away. No citation. No record. No explanation. Just a message. The second attempt was louder. A car bomb detonated beneath the vehicle of a journalist who had helped break the Mercer story. She survived but lost both legs. Her last public statement, delivered from a hospital bed, was simple. They want the dark back. The city shuddered. Fear returned. And with it, the familiar urge to look away. The third attempt was personal. Lamb came home to find his apartment door ajar. Inside, nothing was stolen. Nothing disturbed, except for a single object placed carefully on his kitchen table. A child's sneaker. Small. Pink. Bloodstained. It belonged to a 6-year-old girl who had vanished in 1989. One of the cases in his new file. The message was unmistakable. We know where the bodies are buried. And we know how to bury more. Sleep became impossible. Every shadow breathed threat. Every sound whispered movement. Yet the fear did not slow him. It sharpened him. Because now, the enemy was no longer abstract. It was deliberate. It was watching. And it was afraid. Through months of clandestine work, Lamb and I built a parallel investigation. Off-grid servers, analog backups, dead-drop communication systems designed to bypass digital surveillance. Old techniques resurrected from the Cold War. New ones invented in desperation. Each breakthrough arrived at terrible cost. Informants vanished. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disintegrated. But occasionally, something slipped through. A fragment. A voice recording. A corrupted transmission. Enough to confirm the existence of the curator. And enough to reveal his obsession. Not with power. Not with money. But with narrative. He believed that society required controlled truth, carefully rationed information to prevent chaos. Too much exposure, he argued, shattered trust. And without trust, civilization collapsed. So he curated reality, editing history, deleting contradictions, manufacturing coherence. In his mind, he was not a criminal. He was an author. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A dying man. Former intelligence. Terminal cancer. His last request. A meeting. They found him in a hospice overlooking the sea, his body frail, his eyes still dangerously sharp. You're hunting a ghost, he said, voice ragged. But ghosts leave footprints. He slid a memory card across the table. Financial anomalies. Routing signatures. Behavioral metadata. The curator exists in patterns, not places. Lamb took the card. Who is he? The man smiled faintly. Someone who once believed in justice. Before justice disappointed him. He died 2 hours later. The data took weeks to decode. But slowly, an identity began to coalesce. A former constitutional scholar. a crisis response architect, a man who had once been tasked with designing emergency protocols for national collapse scenarios. His name, Elliot Graves. Presumed dead in a plane crash 25 years earlier. No body recovered. No wreckage conclusively identified. Officially mourned. Quietly buried. But very much alive. And still riding the world. Graves believed chaos was humanity's default state. That only curated truth prevented extinction.
Wars. Panic.
Economic collapse. He saw history as a volatile chemical reaction. His role was to regulate its temperature, to decide which flames were allowed to burn, and which had to be extinguished. The Michigan 1992 cold case had been one of those flames. The woman had uncovered not just corruption, but the machinery of narrative control itself. Her death had not been punishment. It had been censorship. The location came last. An island. Private. Heavily shielded. Unlisted airspace. Unregistered vessels. A place that did not officially exist. A fortress of data and silence rising from the ocean. The final archive. The nerve center. The mind behind the curtain. On a moonless night, a small team approached the island by water, engines cut, drifting on black tides. No lights. No sound. Only the endless breathing of the sea. Lamb stood at the bow, eyes fixed on the looming silhouette of rock and steel. Every step of his journey had led here. Every sacrifice. Every death. Every lie. The truth waited inside.
So, did the end.
They breached the perimeter in silence. Neutralized guards without gunfire. Slipped through corridors pulsing with hidden servers. Descending deeper.
Deeper.
Until the air grew cold and sterile. And there, at the heart of the complex, surrounded by cascading holographic data streams, sat Elliot Graves. Older than expected.
Calm.
Unarmed. He turned slowly in his chair. "I was wondering when you would arrive," he said. Lamb raised his weapon. Graves did not flinch. "Do you know how many wars I've prevented?" he asked softly. "How many genocides died in committee because I altered a single document? You murdered innocents. I edited tragedy." The screens around them flared, live feeds, financial flows, political movements, social unrest models pulsing in real time. "This is not evil," Graves continued. "It is curation. Without me, truth would drown civilization." "You don't get to decide that," Lamb said. Graves smiled faintly. "Every society allows someone to decide. They just prefer not to know who." Outside, storm clouds gathered. The island trembled beneath rising winds. Inside, alarms began to pulse. The final confrontation had begun, and the world, unaware, held its breath. Because in the heart of that hidden fortress, the future of truth itself was about to be decided. And no matter who survived, nothing beyond that night would ever remain the same. The storm struck without mercy. Wind tore across the island, screaming through steel corridors and jagged rock, rattling every surface like a warning from the deep. Waves smashed against the cliffs below, sending tremors through the foundations of the hidden fortress. Inside, red emergency lights bathed the halls in a feverish glow, casting shadows that writhed like living things. Lamb stood motionless, weapon steady, eyes locked on Elliot Graves. The curator. The man who had edited history. Graves did not move. Around him, the servers hummed, an endless ocean of data, trillions of fragments of truth and lies colliding, merging, overwriting. Entire realities lived and died in those circuits. "You came for confession," Graves said calmly. "But confessions are only useful when someone still believes in innocence." Lamb said nothing. Outside, thunder cracked. "You think exposure will save the world," Graves continued. "But exposure is chaos. Raw truth is not enlightenment. It is combustion." He gestured toward the glowing screens. "Do you know how many markets I stabilized last year by leaking a single fabricated memo? How many cities avoided riots because I delayed the release of verified evidence? You rewrote reality. I curated it. Graves slowly rose from his chair. Despite his age, his posture remained unnervingly controlled, as if discipline itself had shaped his bones. Truth, he said, is not moral. It is volatile. Someone must regulate it. And you chose yourself, Lamb replied. No, Graves said softly. The world chose me, over and over again, in silence. A tremor rippled through the complex as another wave slammed the cliffs. This system does not exist because of me, Graves said. I exist because of it. Deep within the facility, encrypted failsafes began to activate. The curator's protocols. If the island fell, the truth would not simply be released. It would be erased. Data centers around the globe would simultaneously purge archives. Historical records would fracture. Legal databases would corrupt. Entire segments of institutional memory would vanish forever. A controlled collapse. An amnesia engineered at planetary scale. Mai's voice crackled in Lamb's earpiece. He's initiating the burn sequence. We've got minutes. Graves smiled faintly. I always planned for this moment. You built a world afraid of its own reflection, Lamb said. Now you're afraid to let it look. Graves studied him, something resembling sadness flickering across his features. You still believe people want to know the truth, he murmured. They don't. They want comfort.
Certainty.
Narrative. He stepped aside, revealing a transparent console pulsing with layered biometric locks. Stop me, he said. If you can. Gunfire erupted in the corridors. The curator's private security forces flooded the complex, moving with mechanical precision. Shadows exploded into chaos. Suppressed shots cracked. Bodies fell soundlessly. Lamb and Mai fought their way toward the core, slipping through smoke and emergency haze, each second devoured by alarms. Servers overheated. Circuits screamed. The building itself seemed to convulse, as if struggling to hold together under the weight of its own secrets. They reached the control chamber as Graves entered his final override sequence. Step away, Lamb ordered. Graves didn't turn. History doesn't belong to you, he said. It belongs to whoever can protect it from humanity.
Lamphai.
The bullet struck Graves in the shoulder, spinning him violently. Blood splashed across the glowing interface. Graves collapsed against the console, breath ragged, eyes still burning with conviction. You'll unleash a storm you cannot contain, he whispered. Then let the world decide, Lamb said. Mai ripped open the main data conduit, plugging in the final extraction drive. Across the globe, secured channels burst alive.
Archive located.
Encrypted vaults opened. Buried truths flooded into public networks with unstoppable force. The burn sequence failed. The world remembered. The curator coughed, crimson staining his lips. Do you know what happens now? He asked weakly. Lamb looked down at him. No more silence, Graves whispered. No more gods behind curtains. His eyes dimmed, and the screens around them exploded into blinding white. The evacuation barely succeeded. Helicopters lifted through shrieking winds as the island tore itself apart. Explosions rippled through the underground complex, collapsing tunnels, shattering steel, swallowing decades of hidden infrastructure into the sea. From the air, Lamb watched the fortress sink beneath black water, its secrets already racing across satellites and servers worldwide. Below, the ocean closed like a wound. The impact was immediate. Governments convulsed. Courts halted proceedings. Intelligence agencies shut down networks. Markets plunged. Protests erupted in every major city. Whistleblowers surfaced by the thousands, emboldened by sudden transparency. Hidden alliances disintegrated. Public trust shattered, then slowly, painfully, began to reform along different lines. A new world struggled into being. Messy, unstable, uncontrolled, but real. In the chaos, one story remained constant. The cold case. The woman whose death had cracked the first fracture. Her name became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of awakening. Her investigation had exposed the architecture of silence itself, and her loss had ignited a reckoning no system could contain. Weeks later, standing on a quiet shoreline, Lamb watched the waves roll endlessly toward land. The storm had passed, but its echoes still vibrated through every institution, every newsroom, every courtroom. Mai stood beside him. "Do you think we did the right thing?" she asked. Lamb considered the question for a long time. "There is no right," he said finally. "Only responsibility." The truth was out. But truth, once released, could never be recaptured. It would wound. It would heal. It would destroy. It would rebuild. And in its wake, the world would have to learn how to live without the comfort of curated lies. Far offshore, nothing remained of the island. Only open water. Endless. Indifferent. But somewhere beneath the waves, in twisted steel and drowned servers, slept the remnants of a system that had once believed it could control history. And now history was free. Unpredictable.
Terrifying. Alive.
The case was closed. But its echoes would never fade. Because some stories, once told, never truly end. They simply become the beginning of something far larger.